that inclusive, healthy, respectful, and safe workplaces, safe workplace environments are crucial to unleashing the creativity and innovation that then drives performance and results. He has worked and served with many healthcare and health service institutions across Alberta and BC. He has also worked with the LGBTQ plus and Indigenous portfolios in health and post-secondary sectors on improving access to healthcare, education, and addressing systemic racism and discrimination within both groups. Dr. Umbalekwa has experience working with several organizations and community groups in creating respectful workplaces, focusing on anti-harassment, anti-bullying, anti-discrimination behaviors in service of diversity, inclusion, and equity. He holds many degrees, as do all our qualifications, as I believe do many of the people in our audience here today. He has a PhD in organizational culture and systems transformation, a master's in organizational systems, a master's in health service administration, and a bachelor in administrative and commercial studies. You're very welcome, Dr.
Thank you.
Kwesi Mbolekwa. I would like to introduce you to our second panelist, Osai Ogiva. Osai holds a Canadian certified inclusion professional designation from the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion and has over a decade. See, I don't think it was me, but I think my microphone might have the flu. It was a different one. Okay, thank you. Over a decade of experience advancing and integrating diversity, equity, and inclusion principles and processes within healthcare, academic, and not-for-profit organizations. She has worked for 8 years in Alberta Health Services as a senior advisor for diversity inclusion in the Employee Relations Unit and has a diversity coordinator in the Primary Care and Chronic Disease Management Unit. Through her education and professional experiences, Osai is skilled at supporting workplace discrimination through an application of human rights legislation and DEI perspectives, patient and employee advocacy, stakeholder engagement, community engagement, psychological safety, program design, and facilitating effective internal and external partnerships, establishing DEI principles and values in policies, practices, and processes. Osai holds a Master's in Public Health from Simon Fraser University in BC, a certificate of infection prevention and control from Queen's University, and a Bachelor of Science degree in microbiology from give me 1 second. It only takes a pause and a moment of concentration. Igbenedion University in Nigeria. She is a PROSCI change management practitioner and has a foundation certificate in public participation from the International Association of Public Participation. Osai is in the active process of completing an advanced certificate in leadership at the University of Alberta. You're very welcome, Osai. And our third panelist is Ola Kunle Odonya. Ola is an equity, diversity, and inclusion specialist at NATE with educational backgrounds in history and international studies, international conflict analysis, and training in Indigenous engagement and collaboration. Ola seeks to make barriers visible, develop innovative strategies for change, as well as assist stakeholders to build development capacity through respectful and collaborative approaches. Since making Edmonton his home, he has been actively involved in community development across the city, including co-founding an amateur soccer team, the Western Eagles Football Club, for racialized people and newcomers in Edmonton. The soccer team was created to foster community integration and connection through social and recreational activities. Ola was also recently selected to serve as part of NASA's astrophysics database of IDEA, inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. practitioners responsible for evaluating incoming funded science activities. He has been bringing his passion for creating equitable spaces as well as his expertise in social policy, arts, diversity and inclusion, and community engagement in this capacity for the past year. You're very welcome, Ola. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the moderator of this panel, Lisa Ochi. Lisa has just graduated from Art and Design at the University of Alberta, specializing in user experience accessibility, which is something we all want a lot, right? Um, Lisa was a representative of vice president with the Black Students Union at the University of Alberta, specializing in events, and has been a member of the Africa Center's Youth to Come Up program, also specializing in events. My apologies. Arts and culture. Arts and culture. Arts and culture. Lisa will be taking us through this panel today.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you to the panelists for gracing us with your presence and expertise today. So the first question I will direct to each one of you, and we will start with Dr. Kwesi Mbolekwa. So can each panelist please share a personal experience where you felt you encountered the glass due to your racial or ethnic background?
Thanks for the question. So actually, one of those realities, say about 1999, Stanford, I had an opportunity to for a position put up by the Vancouver branch. I was going to do that going across country for a position, and there was a test that we had to do, which was called a Charlie test, and my scores, I guess, were something that the managing partner in Calgary had not seen, and basically accused the office in Vancouver of skewing them and said, no, you got to meet that. The fellow in Calgary didn't know what was being shared with you. And what he basically pointed out was, I don't think the city's ready for a black lead to do this. Um, I don't think they would, they would see it as leading that office, etc. And so that was a harsh reality, but it was also a good lesson about this is what life is like. This is what you've got to face. And so it helps build your own internal fortitude, but also your own resiliency to bounce back and just say, excuse me, the hell with it. I'm truth. That was my experience.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much. I had a experience, I'll say a couple of years ago, and this was more interpersonal than systemic. I had an ally who had spoken to a vice president in the organization I was working for at the time, and I told them about the work I was doing, and they believed that my work was beyond my pay grade, and title, so which of course impacted every other thing, including the level to which I would advance in the organization. And after reviewing the couple of policies and practices, the VP decided that they wanted to promote me to a different department at a higher position. But then they needed to go through my director. And I recall very clearly how my director came to my desk and said to me, "Oh, Sai, I got this email from this VP," and then twisted it to say, "You demanded that you don't want to work here anymore and you want them to promote you to this department." That was exactly that was not what has happened. And so I'm sitting there, I'm in this position, and this is someone who like 4 levels above me, and I couldn't really correct what this individual was saying to me. But I remember at that time she said, "Well, so they want to move you to this unit and in this role. But I just want to tell you that if you get there and you don't like it, you can come back here. I'm going to find someone better than you to replace you in this role." And I think that was really to diminish the confidence that I already had from having the conversation on promotion. I ended up not getting the promotion at that time because of everything that had happened and how this leader had de-escalated my confidence. Years later, when I moved up the ladder, and, moved into a higher role, I can tell you that for years, this leader was still coming to me for help, was still coming to me to do the work that she said she was going to find somebody else to do. And that was when it dawned on me that they just didn't want me to advance beyond that level because I was valuable to them at that level and in that space. So that was, a very interpersonal experience that I had around the barriers that Black or other racialized groups can face when it comes to breaking the glass ceiling. Sometimes it happens on a systemic level and in other cases, like my experience at the interpersonal level.
I was just what doctor has said as well because I was very independent at that time, and the job I had, I had to travel across province, Alberta, and I literally putting out fires. You know, but the opportunity came and the leadership position came, and I did want to. But my manager was like, "Yeah, go ahead, just do it." And it takes a lot of effort to want to but I did. I went through all the interviews and so on and so forth. And eventually I was told, oh, we're serious, good, but you don't have leadership skills. And I'm like, oh, that's terrible to hear. It's, but by the time I tried digging into it, eventually I was told, just look around, right? It's not going to happen. But yeah, it's like doctor said, you just have to bounce back and then resilience and ready next, where you find yourself and so
Thank you all for answering that. The next question too, I'll direct to everyone here. What are the most prevalent perceptions or biases that hinder minority groups from advancing in their careers? We'll start with Dr. Boygan.
Well, I don't think it will. Um, I think what a lot of people don't do is reflect on what's the impact of the culture and how they see other people. And if you see how much they project inside them onto others. So gets into that whole topic. Is that an unconscious bias thing or are they conscious of what they're doing to my? So I'm not sure if I can nail it's one thing, but I think culture plays a huge role and the lack of self-awareness um, is significant. That's not to say people don't know what they're doing. I don't subscribe to you do something repetitively and you don't know what the impact is. You've had a chance to see it. That's how I would respond to that one.
That was
Thank
thank
you. I have a question.
Yes, of course. What are the most prevalent misconceptions or biases that hinder minority groups from advancing in their careers?
Okay, I would say for me, sometimes I think the narrative we tell ourselves as minority groups, particularly women and immigrants. Many times, compared to men, you would see that men tend to be very brave when it comes to applying for higher level roles. Not necessarily because they have all the skills, but just because of how society has made men feel comfortable in the workplace. I think as members of minority groups, we need to really look at the narratives and the stories we're telling ourselves. Many of us feel sometimes we're incapable. Even as an immigrant, when I first came to Canada, I questioned everything about myself. I began to question my accent. I began to question the color of my skin, question my education. And I needed to get to that place of confidence where I saw value in everything that I brought to the table. So I think it goes back to us really looking at the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, the experiences that we have, because there are a lot of narratives out there. But the one that I believe that can hinder minority groups is when we are the ones not seeing our own worth and value. And one of the things that has really helped me as a member of a minority group is also beginning to tell myself the positive narrative. I no longer look at job postings or job descriptions and I can do this. I will always throw my hat in the ring, always apply because that's what I've seen and I've learned from people who have advanced in the workplace. I have to put the narrative and the stories I'm telling myself my identity and my experiences.
yeah, that's That's really crucial, really, particularly where we are, where we are right now in the city or across the city, right? Those narratives, um, biases are out there, right? It's not gonna go away tomorrow, next year, or next 10 years. But it depends on how I feel, we have a greater part to play in it as well, right? Yesterday you had a lot of stand up, you had a lot of knowledge, you had a lot of self awareness, and so on and so forth. But I think it starts with us.
Awesome, thank you. The next one, I'll start with Usai, and then if anyone has any input, feel free to jump in. How have the challenges of the glass ceiling affected people health, job satisfaction, or overall well-being among individuals from marginalized communities?
I will tie this. I think because I have a health background, back to the social determinants of health, people find themselves in positions that they are more qualified, they're more qualified for, and they find themselves in positions that are less than their skills, their experiences, and qualifications. It's very demoralizing. And it's not just impacting the person's sense of self-worth, it also impacts your experience in the workplace. It can impact your job security. It can impact how you're showing up at work. It can also impact your self-image. And all of those things, they tie into various other aspects. So when you think about your income level, if you can't rise up to a certain level in your career, your income level is capped. And then your income level is tied to things like the housing conditions in which you live or the places you can afford to live. It's tied to access to, amenities in the community. It's tied to the social groups that you then belong to or the access and resources that you have and opportunities for growth. And so when you think of social determinants of health, it's not just one thing. It becomes cyclical, right? One begins to affect the other. And so when people are not able to break the glass ceiling, it's not just limiting them mentally, it's also limiting level, it's limiting access to opportunities. Your housing, if you have young children, is also going to impact even the things the children are exposed to when it comes to early childhood development. So it's just beyond the money. It's every other thing that is tied to it. And that's the negative impact of when people who are from marginalized communities can break past the glass ceiling.
Awesome, thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. How have the challenges of the glass ceiling affected mental health, job satisfaction, or overall well-being among individuals from marginalized communities?
I think the point I was just made is people do tend to undersell themselves. They don't apply for business which they're all qualified. I think the piece about the demoralization is true, and I'll speak to examples within the, let's say, the municipality and worked in addition to the law enforcement. What I found with the people, racialized people, the people they reported to, all of them were more educated than the people they reported to. And there was an interesting thing in where what you put on your card, so your name and then your degrees afterwards, where there was some concern about, well, some people feel badly because they don't have this. And my response was, tough luck. Didn't you want to have that? Go get it. But don't diminish what we've done because you have not done it. So there's a lot of things that work at one the individual, but also at the group level to send a message to the group as a people. And it tends to, I mentor women and men, but like right now, it's a lot of women. And the issue is self confidence. It undermines their self confidence, their self belief. I had to tell someone twice to apply for it. She got the position, but she didn't believe in herself. And so it's that piece about helping people see what they bring to the table and the value they have and to believe it. So that's where I see what adverse impact is in my own personal experience.
Yeah. For me, um, in addition to the social factors as well, then you also want to look at the snowball effect if I try, I can't get this. How do I respond? Do I turn to things like drugs or do I turn to vices here and there, you know? But I'm happy that the talk of mental health is coming in because it's a real thing, right? And to break a person, break my self-confidence, right? I don't have anything else for you, you know? So the impacts go wide and it varies right across sexes, across cultures, across but it's huge and it's out there and hopefully it's something that we keep talking about. I'm
Awesome. Thank you all. This question again will be for each panelist, but we'll start with Olakunle. What proactive measures can organizations adopt to identify and address unconscious biases within their structures?
um, maybe we can start with an acknowledgement that it exists, because without that, nothing else is going to work, right? And acknowledgement and the readiness to tackle unconscious biases. Every other month, I do facilitate workshops within my institution about unconscious biases and so on and so forth. But um, not everyone agrees it's there, right? So I think on an organizational level, they have to acknowledge that it's there, and it's not just we're human beings. We all have it. It's about 100 and something unconscious biases out there right now, But I think that's the first step, and then you can go to the individual level and then collective things that we can do. If I say all the points, I'm not sure the other panelists would have anything to say. So I'll start with acknowledgement, and then I'll just pass it on to panelists to go on from there.
Osai.
Um, actionable step. Okay, do I believe bias training is the most basic thing any organization should be doing when it comes to action steps in regards to bias? It's really important that organizations take time to identify the biases that actually exist in their systems. And the only way they can identify those biases, one actionable steps is by collecting data. Data and storytelling will help uncover a lot. I know that when we conduct qualitative surveys through the experiences of employees, you get to see and pinpoint. This is where the biases exist in our organization. And what I see many times is some organizations collect the data and then don't act on it. So it's not just collecting the data, but actually applying what it is that you have collected, you have identified for series of data collection, storytelling, qualitative surveys, where biases exist in the system. It's really important that as an organization you begin to take actions, whether that's creating, new action plans, new strategies, whatever that might be in response to what was identified in those stories and data that was collected.
Can you give me the question again?
What proactive measures can organizations adopt to identify and address unconscious biases within their structures?
Okay, first thing that I've done was looking at the executive level. There's a reality we have to understand that it is at the executive level that the direction and the policies are created and the resources are basically made available. And part of that is to help them understand this is a journey of becoming that they're in a place, and if they're aspiring to get to a certain place, it's going to be a journey that is not easy for them. And it is about any leader, before they can lead it, needs to do their own personal work. So they need to start looking from within and start looking in my way and understand this is not a thing you do. Okay? This is a way of being in relationship with others. But that means you also have to understand how are you in relationship with yourself and yourself situated with others. Right? So that's the work they need to do is to understand who am I? And then understand we can talk about equity, diversity, inclusion all you want. If you don't understand that it is grounded in racism, and that racism was a tool to maintain a social and economic order, you miss a big part of why things continue the way they are. Right? So one is to give them an understanding of self and get a mirror into it. They start leading them on that journey. Um, then the diversity, I mean, bias training, you can put it in, embed it in a number of places. So what we did very first place, and what the community's looking for when we talk about diversity, can I see myself or an opportunity while working for that place? But also, as a business owner, I have an opportunity to tap into the economic opportunity of working with the city. Because the cities and provinces have multi-million dollar businesses. So it's about what's the language we use to give people opportunity to access one using those, navigating that system. Um, but also what's the language used to prevent people? So in your ads, I'll give you an illustration. We're looking to bring people on to be the board. And it was all high-powered people, former presidents of national companies, deputy ministers, etc. And I pointed out to the panel, I said, look, you've got here qualification, that's not necessary. You know to sit on a panel. You need people with subject matter expertise. Right? And so I pointed out these are the people that have within the organization, the CEOs. I said, I've sat on boards appointed by CEOs and ADM. I wasn't a CEO, but it was a knowledge. So helping people understand the things you write create barriers. And how are you contributing, perpetuating that? And so when you say it has to be a CEO, that means you're maintaining it's going to be a white cisgender male, right? Because you've not opened it up to the bunch of people. So they're like, oh, wow, I hadn't thought of it that way. So part of this is education, it's awareness. But if you don't move into action, it's meaningless. So whenever I do this work with people, I want make sure your intentions about doing this are very clear, okay? Because you put it out there, you will be held accountable by those that are looking at it. Okay, so let's be clear about that. So that's the way I basically look at it.
It's a difficult thing in reality. I mean, it's not easy to ask folks to change or ask institutions to change, But if anyone is in leadership here, then hopefully they can stand in the gap and push that. And for those of us not in leadership as well, I don't know, should I say it takes patience? I don't know if we have patience, but it's a tough, it's a tough journey to, like you said, in becoming, but it's a very, very tough journey. I think we need to understand that it's a tough
Awesome. So, how can mentoring and sponsorship play a role in aiding individuals from underrepresented backgrounds to navigate and start? Oh, that's
journey. This moment, and Gideon and so many other people. Mentorship, it goes a long way for me personally. For me, I feel my own school of thought is relationships really make things happen, and it also takes me into the part of, and anyone else, into the part of understanding what expertise you're looking for. So for me, I honestly subscribe to the idea of mentorship. Um, if you can get a mentor. And if you can mentor someone because the road isn't straight, right? And thankfully, for those who have answered my call anytime I call, they've been able to provide, help me to where I am today. Right? I keep it constant. It's one of my, so yeah.
exciting.
So I have a good example of sponsorship that really helped my career in breaking the glass ceiling. Many years ago, when I started my diversity, equity, and inclusion career, it wasn't really in Edmonton. It wasn't really something that was popular and out there. And I had the privilege of reporting to a manager who was not also doing anything around it. That was not her job function. But I was the only person on the team who was responsible for diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you remember correctly, that first of all, as a sponsor, every time I found resources, maybe I need to put any cost, Rich Edmonton, Center for Race and Culture, or any virtual course that I found, this leader was always willing to pay for it. She was willing to pay for it. One of the other things that she did was, okay, thank you. She was willing to pay for it. And then as I began to get better at, speaking up and advancing equity within the workspace, I noticed that my managers began to sponsor me in places I've never been to. She will go to meetings, and if people are talking about, oh, we have issues around people from this culture, we don't know how to work with them. She will tell them things like, oh, there's Osai on my team. Osai is so she can help you navigate cultural competence or help you understand cultural safety. And then I'll get emails from those people saying, I met your manager and she spoke very highly of you. She began putting my names in front of leaders that I had never met in the organization. And that was how I started growing. So my role at that time was confined to only a particular division within the organization. And because of how she actively sponsored me in different spaces, people from HR and the Calgary teams, they would actually send invitations for me to travel them and come do workshops or have some consultative process with them. This was a white woman that I was reporting to at that time. And as my career began to progress, I remember one time she said to me, "Oh, Sai, it would be helpful to start looking for opportunities, that put you in a position of leader." And everywhere she went, that active sponsor, because the thing about sponsorship is you're not just mentoring the person, but you're also putting their names, you're giving them visibility where they might not be able to get visibility otherwise. And I remember I no longer work for that organization. I'm now with Canadian Blood Services. I think that part was missed in my bio. I work for Canadian Blood Services now. And I remember when I got the job and I called this person, she was really, really excited. She said, "I, you deserve to be in this role. You deserve to be a manager." I got promoted. This person also reached out again, acknowledge how much she's happy to see, my growth and the ability for me to begin to, strive in leadership. But it all came from having a leader that sponsored me at the beginning stage of my career when I really didn't know what I was doing. She took action at every point in time. So that's how we can break the glass ceiling through active sponsorship.
Yeah.
Mic is for
So
you.
the key to me with the topic of mentorship is it's the opportunity to create access uh, to people who might not have had. So one of the things I do in the workplace is make sure people have an opportunity to present before as an executive, right? To get an understanding, see what the kinds of questions are going to be asked. But it's also about what are the opportunities, what are the developmental opportunities. Um, and so there was some metrics that were up there earlier on, which is what we've talked about is what's the percentage, in the population of whatever the demographic is, but of those people that are there, how many of them are actually being given an opportunity for internships, professional development, mentorship, or sponsorship? So what have you actually done to create those opportunities for people? That's a question I typically ask. And then of myself, it's what am I doing? Who am I helping? Who am I supporting? Because one thing I keep telling people over and over again is if you don't ask, you'll never get. If you don't ask, you'll never get. Believe in yourself and go for it. You are far better than you think you are. Typically, the inner voices, the inner gremlins people have are their own worst enemies, right? It holds them back. And I've been subject to that too, saying, what the hell, why didn't I bother? But it's also having had people who believed in you and saw in you things you didn't see in yourself. That one would take for granted. So there's some things I take for granted about myself that I was told by a couple of CEOs, no, man, you don't understand. That is a huge, big deal. And that's why you're sitting at that table. That's why you're the non-executive at the executive table, way back when. So it's understanding and acknowledging the strengths that lie within you, right? And then as a mentor, it is helping people to see what strengths they have within them and giving them the confidence and support to 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 extend your grasp. Um, that's important, right?
So Dr. Mbulik, I'll start by directing this question to you, and then anyone else can jump in as well if you have any input. Can you share successful strategies or programs you've encountered or been a part of that aim at dismantling the glass?
Well, it depends how you define success. There's any number of ways. One of them, which I think was terrific, was with the city of Calgary. Okay. The city passed in June 15, 2020, an order that they would become an anti-racist city. Okay. And what did that mean? And so basically, what was written was basically carte blanche. So they brought me in, and I said, "Did you read what you put in here? Do you understand what this means?" because you've given me license to look at your structure, your policies, practices, and this is what I'm going to do. And so part of it was starting with the executive. And so they committed to an hour and a half every month of anti-racism teaching. And then they extended, did it for a year, and then extended for another year. But underneath, they had supported the resource groups within areas to start the work. So we get two approaches. The bottom is getting permission to do this, and they're getting the funded to do that work. And these people are doing the home work, right, to understand the impact they have. And so that to me was a big success because our anti-racism team started from nothing. You know, we had an idea, and now I think there's 12, 15 people on the team, right? So it's not something that's just gloss. It's they've put in significant resources to make it go. We then ended up I traveled over to the city police service to help them with that, and they had followed what we had been doing. So the ripple effect of what you're doing, but it's really about helping to change people's attitudes, mentality, and sense of security in doing this work. Because at the end of the day, if the leaders who hold the resources are not on board, it doesn't matter, right? You've got to get them on board in a way that is substantive and meaningful.
Thank you. Anyone else like to jump in to answer that? Yeah. Could you share successful strategies or programs you've encountered or been a part of that aim at dismantling the glass?
Yeah, I think just adding what the doctor has said, the employee resource groups very very critical. In Canadian Blood Services, one of the things that we do with our employee resource groups is not just a place for people to come and talk. They hold us accountable to the things we have committed to. So I'm going to give examples. We have, you know, active resource groups, and then we have a women's empowerment network. And the BIPOC employee resource group, someone would say to me when to their meeting, uh, we want to hear what the organization is doing to advance for Black, Indigenous people of color employees, or removing barriers for our Black, Indigenous people of color donors. And they hold us accountable. So what I do is I, look across the organization, the people who are actively taking steps or actively involved in projects that impact those communities. I bring them in on a regular basis to give updates, to seek consultation from the group, to get their participation, their feedback. At the end of the day, we have a report that we present to the organization, and we share that report with the organization. And we also share that report with the organization. And we also when we talk about allyship, it's only members of underrepresented or equity deserving groups that need allies, but we all do. We need people to speak up for us and stand up for us at various points in our careers. So I think one of the things that allyship can help us with when it comes to breaking the glass ceiling is having that collective voice, recognizing, and I see employee resource groups as a form of allyship, is having that collective voice. But I also see other factors too as well, like when you have active DEI councils, DEI committees, those are allyship groups. Those are groups that can speak up, identify areas in the organization where they need to advocate for others, where they need to stand up and speak up for others. So I think when it comes to breaking glass ceilings, it's looking at the different structures we already have in place. Who are the people involved? I always tell groups or committees when they're forming, many of them will say, this is a safe space for us and we don't want allies in the group. And I always tell them, you need allies in the group because the allies sometimes can reach places that you can't reach. They can advocate for you in spaces that your feet might not be able to get to. And so when you understand the power of allyship in breaking glass ceilings, we now, continue to foster those environments where people can come together in the workplace. And that's the thing I'm seeing now with organizations. Even though a lot of us are working virtually, they are beginning to create opportunities for people to connect, also in person. Connect in person, build and foster those relationships, come together as a group. I find that as a group, when you bring forward a problem, organizations tend to take action. So I'm going to give an example. One time in our, I think they call it the town hall meeting we're having with the CEO, some employees raised right there and they talked about period equity, and it was my first time hearing it, and I thought, what's that? And they talked about organizations providing access to sanitary products for people who need them in the facilities. And because there were a group of people who had identified that as a need, that form of allyship, Canadian Blood Services took action. So now in our facilities, you would find those products in the washrooms because there was that collective voice. So it's recognizing sometimes the power in that unity, forming one shared voice and speaking up when we need to, standing up and advocating as needed.
Thank you. And thank you all for sharing your expertise. We'll take this time to take some questions from the audience before we end the session. So if anyone has a question for any of our panelists, please put your hand up and the MC will come to you with the mic.
Question for you.
Going once? Okay, well, that comes to the end of the session. Does anyone have any closing remarks before we get off the stage?
Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much for inviting
Well,
me.
thank you. I would close, one thing I want to say to everyone here is, one, be aware of your environment. We have the privilege of being oblivious to the environments around us because we're so caught up in our own day to day, and some of the stuff that's happening is right in front of our eyes and we miss it. So one, become more aware of what's around you and in front of you. And two, please find the strength within to raise your voice. Okay? You have perhaps not as much appreciation of the impact of your action on other people and the ripple effect that will have. Okay? So thank you very much. Yeah.
Sorry, I have a question regarding Calgary. So I'm just curious to the City of Calgary's implementation for anti-racism. I was just wondering, what is the process that they took and what came out of it in terms of implementation? Who were the people that benefited? And then concretely, what did that look like for the City of Calgary's
Right.
police force?
So there's two pieces. So this police service is separate from the city as a distinct entity. So it's one, understand it's a journey. It's not done. Okay. So they went out to the community, got an external consulting company to basically go out to the racialized communities and ask them. The city set up and this was where they had a challenge. They set up what was the language they used? An action committee. And the action committee took that word action to heart, where they told council, you gave us this, we expect you to do the following. Where they had a bit of a problem was thinking that their action involve going into the actual city administration and tell them what to do. And that's the point at which I said, we had a conversation very frank about what the hell do you know about how this place goes? What are you going to speak to? What you can speak to is the experience you've got, but necessarily about how things actually go within inside. We've got that. We're going to engage with you, etc. So we had a group for the community, a group for the administration, and a group for working with the enforcement agencies. Three distinct leads working on that. To then work around how do you go, what are the priorities going to be, what are the actions you're going to do, and what is the time frame in which you're going to do that work. Okay, so that work is ongoing. Mine was the organization, so the work with the executive and then resources within the organization. We changed our outcomes were basically for interview and recruitment. Everybody who sat on a panel, okay, interview panel, had to have DI training. That was the first thing they did. They all got DI training. Second was we had to, the lens of our language of our ads, the criteria we used, the process for evaluation and then hiring were all seen through the lens of DEI. End of story. Two, we started that at anyone at a management level because you can't do the whole organization. So there was a commitment to start doing this this way. So those were some of the things that we were doing within the city, within the police service. That was an interesting one. I went over there, and what we had to do was first get them to actually talk and admit the thing actually existed. So I went to the parades. Parades are what you call departmental meetings, but that's what they call them. And so I also went on, patrols. Get in the cop car, go see what the world is like, because it gets credibility for, oh, he knows, he's seen. It's not just some talking head who has no clue. But also once they started getting to talk to you, like, oh, he's pretty cool. I can talk to this guy. Now I trust. Now I can lean into that conversation. So sometimes we talk about the speed with which this work goes. I'm telling you flat out, this is about changing people's values, beliefs, systems, and dispositions. That is not going to happen overnight. Okay? You've all got children or spouses or parents or siblings. Have you ever tried to change the behavior of those people? You think you talk once and it changes? I don't think so. So this is the same sort of thing. It's going to take time, it's going to take effort, and you got to keep knocking on the door.
Thank you so much. Any last questions before we close? Okay, well, thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much.
Oh, okay.
I don't
Sure.
know.
Standing or sitting?
break with Dr. Georgette Zanatti. And I have to tell you, when I was excited about this presentation just by the information I had, I am so excited about this presentation now. So let me first take you through some of Dr. Zanatti's background. Currently, she's the founder and CEO of Women Helping Empower Women. Phew. Wait. Woo. That's what it is. Women Helping Empower Women. Woo. She's also the Executive Vice President of Corporate Class Incorporated and Practice Lead for their Center for Diversity and Inclusion. Dr. Zanatti holds a bachelor's degree in English and Political Science, a Master of Business Administration, a Master's of Science, and a certificate in Leading Strategic Change and Organizations from Harvard University. She holds a doctorate in Business Administration, a joint program with Rotman School of Business and Henley School of Business. Dr. Zanatti's research focuses on business leadership, diversity, inclusion, and the future of leadership. She is a frequent contributor and thought leader to Forbes on issues of leadership, inclusion, and business, and has been a frequent global panelist, keynote, and public speaker, including a TEDx talk, and most recently at the World Diversity and Leadership Conference. She is the recipient of the Canadian University Productivity Award, as well as the Stepping Up Award in recognition of innovation in the workplace. In 2018, she was named an Immigrant Woman of Inspiration by the Canadian Immigrant Publication and has been recognized by the Premier of Ontario and federal members of Parliament in Canada for her volunteerism and work in the community. She serves as a senior advisor to Nobellum, a nonprofit social and technology enterprise for Black founders in STEM. She is also on the board of advisors for the Entrepreneurship and Leadership Learning Alliance, ELA, at York University, fund director at the Creative Hub 1352, and is the co-chair, the inaugural Canadian chapter of CHIPS, a global organization that supports women in intellectual property and technology. As the founder of love that, Women Helping Empower Women, Dr. Zanatti published a book on the scarcity of women and diversity in leadership. She has the book with her, and 100% of the proceeds go to support WOO's work. The book is called Why Not You? She has been awarded the CILAR, C-I-L-A-R, Aspiring Innovator of the Year Award. This inaugural award recognizes Black, Indigenous peoples, and people of color positively impacting their communities and demonstrating great innovations. And most recently, the Remarkable Citizen Award in Ontario, as well as the Heritage Hero Award in Mississauga. She is currently a nominee for the Global Women's Business Award. Right?
Thanks.
And on top of that, I would really, from the bottom of my heart, like you to give this woman some love. She stands before us a Palestinian woman.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Hopefully we'll get the slides up and running. Hi, so thank you so much for that very long and generous introduction. We got to get that down to 250 words, I think, right? I hope you're all doing okay. So intersectionality and privilege, I'm going to move through some of the stuff because I was attending some of the earlier sessions, so I don't want to overly repeat, but I do want to talk a little bit. I start usually by this quote, which I love a lot. It says, diversity is counting the numbers, inclusion is making the numbers count. Now, it seems simple enough, but the reality is when we look at most organizations, they have a lot of diversity, so what I call in the front lines, right? The entry-level positions. We don't see that as much in the upper echelons of organizations. So to give you an example that I often like to use, when we look at CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, when you look at those numbers, and I always start with what I call a gendered lens. So women in 1999, 2% of Fortune 500 companies, right? 2%. Today, that number is 7%. So 25 years later, we've only moved up a small bit. Now, since 1999, there has only been 17 Black CEOs, okay? So let that sink in. So we know there isn't a shortage of talent or education. So we know there is institutional bias and there's a lot of privilege at play. So, what is bias? It's been covered, but I just want, I start out with this quote by David Walker says, if you have a brain, you're biased. And the reason I start with this is because often people say, I love everybody. And I go, don't we all? We all love everybody, right? We like everybody. We're all good people. But if you have a brain, you are biased. And in fact, 90% of our thought processes are unconscious and sort of working this part of our brain that we're not fully aware of and are, accumulate over time. So for that reason, no matter how much you might like somebody or like people or have good intentions, and I always like to begin with, I do believe for the most part, people have good intentions. Now, there was a lot of talk today about how do you take those good intentions, not just implement, i.e. tick off the box, but actually move to what I call integration, right? Actually changing mindsets, changing behavior, actually making a difference. And so, people often use, when we talk about explicit bias, racialized examples. I like to use something that maybe we don't always think about. So I always say, what's your favorite team locally here? What's a good Calgary team or Edmonton team or Alberta team? Edmonton Oilers. Okay. So imagine there was like a nail-gripping game of the Oilers like the night before, and you're in line at Costco or Walmart or whatever, Sobeys or Loblaws or whatever it is that you shop. And you start talking to someone, you see them wearing the shirt, and you go, that was a great game last night. And you start chit-chatting, or whether it's in the elevator. That is bias. That's an explicit form of bias. And so people do this all the time. And you might think, well, duh, Georgette, I think I know that already. Maybe. But I want you to think about other people who are maybe not from seeing the world from the same lens as you and talking to people. And that's called an affinity bias, which I know was covered earlier. But the reality is we do this every single day, not without even realizing we're doing it. So we know that unconscious bias has these stereotypes, assumptions that we make. And so that gives us a sense of privilege in terms of how we see us versus them in many ways in our lenses. Oh, there we go. So I often talk about how are we making decisions when we're hiring. So there was a lot of conversations in the earlier panel about that. So I said to you at the beginning, I'm going to talk a little bit about, beginning with what I call a gendered lens, right? So if you think about women are just a slice of the diversity pie, imagine the complexities that come when you start adding things like skin tone, accent, hijab, disability, sexual orientation, and more. Those are more and more layers and boundaries of complexities in giving somebody really the opportunity to be able to have what I'm going to call fair hiring practices. And so I want to share this with you. How many of you guys are familiar with the show The Voice or have seen it? Know what I'm talking about? Okay, well, before The Voice was this. And so this is a case study of, in the United States, orchestras have 100 spots. So for years, they could not increase the number of women in orchestras. So they said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to move to blind auditions. So they put up a screen, but they didn't just put up a screen. They made people take off their shoes. Now you're going to say, shoes? Why are they taking off their shoes? Tell you why. This way, you don't hear the clickety-clack of a woman's heel or the thumpity-thump of a man's shoe. So guess what happened? 5% to 30% women, right? You only heard talent, right? So we know bias is at play. Let me give you another example. You'll see it says here June 25th, but it's June 25th, 2020. So the United States Army decided that it wanted to be really proactive and actually increase the number of African-American officers in the US from 1 to 4-star generals. Great, good intentions, right? Intention, implementation, integration. Intentions were good. So they do this, and they're just not seeing the same level of increase in numbers. So they bring in MIT, they bring in Harvard, they do all these assessments, and guess what? In 98.8% of the cases, had the photos not been there, 200 more African Americans would have had promotions between 1 to 4-star generals. Okay? So the intentions were good. Bias was at play throughout the photos. So, when we think about, women of color, Hispanic women, BIPOC community, these are some of the numbers that really impacted women in general when it came to COVID. So we saw a lot of people exiting. But again, I just wanted to share that with you because this is not insignificant. And that really shifted the course of, the gender equity gap, which was already over 100 years. Now it's 131 years. How many of you are familiar with this report, The Tallest Poppy? Anybody have heard of it or seen it? Okay, 1 or 2 people. So this is nothing to do with me. This is the Women of Influence. So they did this study in 2018 in the Canadian context. They actually just redid it this year in January and February. It was global. So you might say, what is this thing, tallest poppy? It's actually an Australian, New Zealand term. It's all about the idea that poppies all grow at a certain height, but one gets a little too tall, they just cut it down to size. So I wanted to think about the conversations you were having just earlier about access, about sponsorship, about all of that. So imagine if you're a rising star and then you get cut down to size. And to me, all I could think of when I was hearing these things was not only microaggressions, but what I've been hearing so far today is the impact on self and self-worth and how you see in your confidence, right? So in this case, when you look at it, who's doing the cutting? Well, it used to be mostly women. It's now women, it's men, it's your peers. And what you're doing is losing top talent along the way as a result of that. And so this was very interesting in that case. So, I was working, I do a lot of work in this space, and I was doing a course with somebody, and they said to me, oh, fit is so important. So I say to people, how often when we hire, we make decisions, how are you hiring? And I know this was covered earlier, but, how often do we hear the word fit? I don't know, there's just something about them, I'm not sure if they're the right fit. So are you talking personality, or are you talking skill set? Are you talking what they look like? What does that actually mean? So when, I was involved in tons of hires, I spent 30 years working at the University of Toronto. And when we would be on panels and someone would say, I'm not sure if they're the right fit, I'd have to go back and say, so tell me what that means for you. So what was it? Or I would challenge them on questions. So question 4 was really important, right? That was a good question. So candidate A said this, candidate B said this, candidate C said this, right? Oh, and I actually had this happen where somebody said in a meeting, like, oh, I really like this person. And I'm thinking, you didn't hear what they said. That person could have been that woman's brother. I'll be honest with you. Like, it definitely not. So I said, go to question 4. We all agreed that was a key question. Oh, I don't remember him saying that. I really thought he said this. Okay, question number 6. Document, hold them accountable. So, implicit bias, 11 million pieces of information go through our brains like a great, great machine. I know we got AI, but your brain's a good machine too. But we are only consciously aware of a small number of these. So it was really important for us to be aware of how this all plays out. Now, I know you've heard the term intersectionality, but what I wanted to do is introduce Kimberly Crenshaw. That's not her. Well, she defines it. Now, her work, for some of you may know, goes back decades. But really, it started out when she was doing work around women, and then realized that, the experience of Black women and white women is not the same. It's certainly not the same in the United States, anywhere, but certainly not there at that time. And so this is how that term was coined, and now it's expanded and it's in explanation. Oh, it's not playing. Okay, so I can't hear the voice, so I'm going to just let that play, but I'll explain it to you, although I'm not Kimberly Crenshaw. But she talks about the fact that there's women, white women, and those experiences are very different, and how we see ourselves, and she needed a new term to kind of explain the differences in those experiences and the lived experiences. So I wanted to introduce this concept to you. Has anybody ever seen this before, the social identity wheel? Some. Okay. So this is, I was sitting on a panel, I think it was last year or the year before, and what was fascinating for me was this, they were talking about how terrible this thing was. Well, I'll tell you why it was terrible. And I left, I was the only Canadian on the panel. But what was interesting was this was sent home with a 12-year-old, I think in the middle of, I don't know where, USA. So I can imagine if you sent this home with a 12-year-old, a parent would freak out, especially if it had no context. So this really, the reason I'm introducing this to you is I want you to think about how we're all a kaleidoscope, how we all show up. But the reality is everybody we deal with in the workplace is also showing up differently and is also a kaleidoscope, right? And that might change every day. So there are days where you walk in, I think about myself. I walk into a room, sometimes I'm the only woman. I'm very consciously aware of my gender, more so than I am of my ethnicity or whatever else it may be. Just the definition. And the reality is, it manifests every single day. In the Canadian context, I've done a lot of this training, and I want you to think about the fact that when I do this training, it is not often to a racialized group. So I have to remind them that, because often I go, well, it's worse in the United States. And I have to remind them that it exists every single day, 24/7 in our life, and it's not that. This is some data just about what happens when you speak up. So we talk about sponsorship, we talk about allyship, but often if women do speak up, particularly in the workplace, there is this sort of, I'm going to call it double, triple, quadruple whammy, whatever you want to call it, in terms of that. This is really interesting. This is research that was done. And the reason I like sharing this is because I've actually worked with people who've been through these jobs. So, we think a lot about we're moving to a really great place when it comes to DEI and privilege and intersectionality and trying to understand it more in organizations. So, think about how many companies are now hiring what I call chief diversity officers, right? Fantastic. They come in, they go into these roles. We're going to support you. Guess what happens? They start identifying things that need to get changed. What happens when they do that? You get some pushback. And in fact, I literally remember coaching some, it was a gentleman out in Chicago who called me, and he'd been in the job 6 months. He said, I want to quit. I said, you cannot quit. He literally, and I said, I'm going to share this with you. I want to show you where you are in this, and you need to kind of stay the course. Let me help you figure out how to navigate it. I also want to bring up multi-generational trauma. We often hear this term, intergenerational, multi-generational. We hear it often with our Indigenous people, but obviously when it comes to race, it's important. And I want you to think, I was introduced earlier in terms of my own ethnicity, thinking about the war in the Middle East. All I keep thinking about is the intergenerational trauma that people are going to have for centuries to come, right? Because we carry this with us. So how do we create psychological safety in the workplace? Well, it starts with us, obviously, each one of us. But as leaders, it's important to frame the work around shared purpose. That is really key and critical. So how do you do that? So people have to see themselves in what we're talking about, right? When we're talking about, well, the company, this is what it needs to do. Where are they? We talked about ERGs earlier. I always say it's great if you have an ERG, but if that ERG is not reporting to the champion in the organization that is actually committed to making change, you've just ticked off the box. Thank you very much. You move from, what I say, intention to implementation, but no integration at the end of the day. We want to invite participation. That means if we don't know something, we ask. We say, well, what do you think? What is your perspective on that? What is your lived experience? How does that change how we are going to create whatever it is, whether it's an ERG or a process or a plan? And make sure that we are setting up structures for success, not failure, right? So that means it's a reiterative process. And then, we want to make sure that we destigmatize things. So sometimes I say to folks, sometimes someone may say something that is offensive to me or to you or whatever it may be. I'll give you a free pass once. Maybe they don't know. It happens more than once. We're gonna have a conversation, a very serious conversation, right? So sometimes someone may say something. I'm gonna assume they have good intentions, that they didn't know, right? But if it happens more than once, then it's a problem. So we talk about what our, those elements look like. And, if you really want to have the confidence and inspiration for creating great teams, people need to feel trust. And we talked a lot about that earlier, but I think it's so important for us to think about this idea of connectedness and safety when you show up to work. So, we talk about inclusion, wanting to be, belong. How do you belong? How do you feel like you belong? Well, you cannot belong in any place. If you don't see people that look like you in places and you walk in and you're the only one or you're the only. But second of all, at the same time, we also want to make sure that we're creating conditions so people feel that they can come and speak up and not be reprimanded when they do that. So I want to ask each of you, has there ever been a time where you felt, that you were excluded in a conversation? What did that look like? Or excluded in a process? Because I can certainly tell you that's happened to me. And I often say that I have no problem speaking up. But I also feel in many ways I'm a little bit lucky. I came to Canada as a young child. I grew up in a small town called Oshawa, and there were no people that were like me of my background. And so at a very early stage, I had to own who I was, accept it, and realize that this was who I was. And so that kind of forced me, I always say, a little bit of like a delusional sense of self, but this is who I am. I know what I bring to the table. And if you don't like me, man, oh man, are you ever missing out? And that's the story I told myself. So, but when there have been times when I have been omitted, or other people I've seen have been omitted out of conversations. And so has that ever happened to anyone, and how did that make you feel? Yes, right? Yeah. And how do you address it, right? Yes?
Well, sure, good one, please. I had that sitting on a panel I alluded to earlier on, and we've gone around and they missed me.
How can they miss you?
Someone just so they went to the recruiter, and the recruiter turned around and said, actually, I'd like to hear what Kwesi's got to say.
Yeah.
And that reframed them, and it's like, oh. And it was interesting how I felt in the moment, but it was much more redeeming to hear someone recognize it and address it.
Yeah, and I think that's important. So we're going to be talking a little bit about allyship as well, but this is why it matters, right? And we want to think a little bit about the emotions. Now, what I'm going to say is this. There have been times where I have been my authority has been questioned. I've been asked why, my qualifications for jobs in places where my equals were standing right there. When you have adversity facing you, what I've done is lean into it and taken back the room and owned it. So when someone has said to me, I was presenting many years back when I was at the university about the campaign that we were leading, Canada's largest campaign in Canadian history, talking about it. First question from the audience, an older white gentleman said to me, "What are your qualifications for your position?" And this was live streamed, and it was, I could people going and murmuring, and then the chair of that committee went, "Did he just ask her for her CV?" And so I looked and I smiled nicely and I said, "Thank you so much for your question. Let me tell you a little bit about myself." And I took 3 to 5 minutes to talk about how I walk on water, how I've knocked everything out of the park. And then I smiled nicely and said, "Does that answer your question?" He went, "Yeah, thanks." I said, "Oh, no, thank you for asking." And then we went back to business. So what was really interesting about that was everyone's phones were off. And when I turned my phone back on, it was blowing up with congratulations on how well you handled it. So we are going to always face challenges. If you're going to question who I am, I'm going to tell you how awesome I am and how I own the room. And if you don't know it, you're going to know it again and again and again. So thank you for that. So you know what, and what that is not only did it, I felt more empowered by the end for thank you for giving me the floor, but I think there were other people in the room that said, "Thank you for doing that. I'm going to do that again myself." And that, to me, is when you feel excluded or undermined. Again, it creates a bit of identity threat. I think it's so important for us to also think a little bit about, how many of you journal? Do you keep journals? If you don't, I think it's worthwhile doing. Yeah, thinking a little bit about yourself. If something went sideways today, there was something that really upset you, it is important to think about that, because you're going to lean into that power. And the next time that happens, you're going to be able to manage it. And I'm going to give you a little tool that I use, that the FBI and CIA use. So when somebody, earlier there's some conversations about how do you handle stuff. SBI. So rather than actually, FBI, CIA, of course, they're going to have a 3-letter word, SBI. So what that is really thinking about when I've had situations with people and I've had to call them out, I don't go in and go, "Hey, we need to talk. Like, I got to tell you, like, you were not very good today." No, 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 no. I go in and I say, "We need to have an SBI moment." So this morning, the situation was as follows. This was the behavior that I witnessed. This was the impact on me and everybody else in the room as a result of what you did. And I leave them to explain. Now, they might say, "Well, I've had a really bad day, blah, blah." Maybe you did, maybe you didn't, but let them speak. We can agree to disagree, but I am not going to say you. I'm going to focus on the situation, the behavior, and the impact, because that behavior needs to change. And that impact was not just on me, because if you impacted me, you impacted other people who felt the energy change, right? This question. So how often do we meet someone and we go, "Hey, where are you from?" I say, people, don't leave with that. You just literally told me that I'm not from here, right? So often when I do training, and again, I say it's not mostly a racialized group, people will say, "Well, that's, I asked people that." And someone said to me, I was interviewing someone once, and can I ask them? Because I really meant, like, are they from like Toronto, Oakville, or are they like out of province? I'm like, okay, that's not exactly how it came across. But if you are asking somebody where you're from, maybe after we've met for half an hour, we've chit-chatted, you might say, if I say back home, you might say, "Well, where's home?" Right? But don't start with where you're from, because you're basically telling me I'm not Canadian and I'm not from here. These are different microaggressions that play out. And the reason this is so important is we often don't think they are microaggressions. People ask us all sorts of questions or make assumptions about things every single day. I was having conversations earlier about the Middle East and, how people sort of see certain people. We have assumptions of what that's portrayed, whether it's in the media, and it plays the same thing for our BIPOC community. So I want to talk a little bit about white privilege. And I don't know if the audio is going to work, because the audio is really, really important in this. But I often share this as a precursor to the video I play. The end result is the same, but sure, it's a lot harder for her to get to the end game, right? So I often use someone named Robin DiAngelo, who some of you may or may not know. Now, you might say to me, somebody said to me, "But how come you don't use the person of color to talk about white privilege?" I'll tell you why, because she's talking to her fellow white people. And so it was very important for me, for her to speak to them when I do my training. So I don't know if this is going to play. Yeah, okay, so you cannot hear it. So I'll let her play, I'll let that play in the background while I tell you kind of the summary, although I'm not going to say it as good as her. So she talks about standing next to a black man while she was presenting once. And a woman from the audience said, I don't see color, right? And how often do we say, I don't see color? You've heard people say, I don't see color. So he's basically says to her, then you don't see me. You don't see me, you don't understand my history, you don't understand the complexity, you don't understand how painful that is. So when you say to somebody, you know, a white person saying to somebody, I don't see color, that's basically what you're saying back, right? So this is the reason when I play that video or we talk about, you know, I have black friends, as if somehow that actually means that, well, like, again, takes that apart and says, well, when you're actually saying that, well, you could have lots of people that you're friends with, but we know proximity doesn't mean that you can't be a racist.
To be white in so many ways is to be raised, to be functional.
It's okay. If you can play it, it's okay. But if you don't, then I can move on. I can move on. It's okay. I'll move on. Thank you. If we can get the presentation back up, that would be good. So while you do that, while you get the next slide up, what I think is important is if you have a chance to listen to some of her stuff, I think it's good. So I use her because when we do training, it is actually usually a very sort of a different type of audience. And when I do corporate training, I feel it's important. I'm gonna play. There we go. I use something called the privilege checklist. Has anybody heard of this? Yes, okay. So when I've taught at Western and Rotman, I've used this. And the reason this is an interesting list is it takes 2 minutes to fill out, right? But on that list are simple things like I can, you know, buy a card for my partner. I can walk up a set of stairs. And people say, why is that even there? You know, I don't understand what that means. And I say to folks, you know, think about how often you're invited to an event, a wedding, whatever it may be. And people say, do you have any food allergies? You know, or do you eat shellfish? But then they don't ask you, can you even get into the building, right? So if you can walk upstairs, you have privilege. If you can buy a card, hold hands with your partner, and they're same sex, that's privilege. Because in some places, you could get killed for that. So this is really what that is. It's a different form of privilege that we may have. When we talk about inclusion in organizations, you know, this is sort of a very high-level structure, what that is. We talk about wanting to seek different perspectives with people. And I think that's important. We say that, but do we want to actually hear it and integrate it? It's a different story. So I want to hear your opinion, but if we're not implementing your opinion, then it doesn't really matter. And again, this is another video that I'm going to share with you. It's one of my favorites. It's really funny. It's a TED Talk.
Comes up to you and says, excuse me, what is the name of this block?
This is funny.
And you say, I'm sorry, well, this is Oak Street, that's Elm Street. This is 26th, that's 27th. He says, okay, but what is the name of that block? You say, well, blocks don't have names. Streets have names. Blocks are just the unnamed spaces in between streets. He leaves a little confused and disappointed. So now imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in Japan. You turn to a person next to you and say, excuse me, what is the name of this street? And they say, oh, well, that's block 17 and this is block 16. And you say, okay, but what is the name of this street? And they say, well, streets don't have names. Blocks have names. Just look at Google Maps here. There's block 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. All of these blocks have names, and the streets are just the unnamed spaces in between the blocks. And you say, okay, then how do you know your home address? I said, well, easy. This is District 8. There's block 17, house number 1. They say, okay, but walking around the neighborhood, I noticed that the house numbers don't go in order. I said, of course they do. They go in the order in which they were built. The first house ever built on a block is house number 1. The second house ever built is house number 2. Third is house number 3. It's easy, it's obvious. So I love that sometimes we need to go to the opposite side of the world to realize assumptions we didn't even know we had and realize that the opposite of them may also be true. So for example, there are doctors in China who believe that it's their job to keep you healthy. So any month you are healthy, you pay them. And when you're sick, you don't have to pay them because they failed at their job. They get rich when you're healthy, not sick. In most music, we think of the 1 as the downbeat, the beginning of the musical phrase. 1, 2, 3, 4. But in West African music, the 1 is thought of as the end of the phrase, like the period at the end of a sentence. So you can hear it not just in the phrasing, but the way they count off their music. 2, 3, 4, 1. And this map is also accurate. There's a saying that whatever true thing you can say about India, the opposite is also true. So let's never forget, whether at TED or anywhere else, that whatever brilliant ideas you have or hear, that the opposite may also be true. Domo arigatou gozaimashita.
May be different than ours, right? So when we think about our own intersectionality, we think about our own lived experiences, what we think may be kind of the right way to do things, active all together, right? So I want to give you a little exercise. Do we have time for 5 minutes? Yes? Okay. Whoever you're sitting next to, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do this. And what I want to do is do a question, ask them questions. And this is a really good tool. It's a great icebreaker, by the way, whenever you want to do it. So you're not going to be talking to them about, well, we both wear glasses, we have curly hair, we have whatever, I'm wearing black. It cannot be anything physical. Okay? So you're going to go a little bit deeper, find something out about that person. I'm going to give you literally 5 minutes, and then we're going to come back. Okay? I'm going to pause for 5. Go. Pause. Same word, same and different. Similarities and differences, both. Okay. Okay. I'm going to just give them 5 minutes on this. Okay. Very good. Let me do you. No.
We're having a hard time finding things we don't have.
Okay. Where did you grow up? Places you grew up, maybe? There you go. All right, I'm going to give you 1 more minute, and then we're going to come back.
That's crazy.
All right. All right, I'm going to bring you back. So are we finished? Okay. All right. So I'm assuming you're with people that you know for the most part, right? So I know you two work together, right? You said that earlier? Yeah. So was there anything you learned about each other they didn't already know in terms of similarities or differences? Okay. So like, give me an example.
Well, we talked about age, for example, and kind of categorized ourselves where we fit in that whole millennial
Okay.
type of competition. Kind of defined our cultures, so Ghanaian and Trinidadian.
Okay.
Figured out where we're from in the world.
With any differences?
You need similarity?
Differences, there's both, right? Or you maybe didn't get too far as his differences yet?
Those were
Oh, those were differences, sorry, my similarities, that's right, that's right.
that we both work for the same school board.
Okay,
We're both from minority groups. We both are educated.
very
Both
good.
are homeowners.
Oh, very good, okay, that's, yeah, did you know you're both homeowners before? Yeah, okay. Anybody do it with somebody that they found something different or new about? Over here? Okay, so the reason we do this test, you might wonder, well, what was the purpose of this? So the reason we do this is when you start out with this often as an icebreaker, what it does is it allows you to get people, especially when we talk about bias, privilege, intersectionality, it gets you to get beyond the skin deep, right? So we meet people for the first few minutes, we make all these assumptions. When you do a test like this, when you get them people to break up and it can't be about the things that we see, it forces us to get to know them just a little bit beyond the surface level, and that's why we do it. And there's always some interesting things. Like I've done this with companies where, someone will say, I had no idea the person next to me plays the piano or owned a business as well as a carpenter or whatever it may be. So of course, I love this quote from the Neuro Leadership Institute. If you're not actively including, you're probably accidentally excluding. So often when I work with companies and, there are conversations about, creating ERGs and so forth, I'm always saying, well, who's not at the table that should be at the table? Have we thought about everybody? Right? Because we're often thinking we know, but do we really know whose voice is not actually being heard? Yeah. So if you're not aren't actively including, you're probably accidentally excluding. I start out with the sense that I believe people have good intentions. So then. I'm going to assume that people are going in with good intentions. I don't know that every single person, but I assume people are going in with good intentions for the most part. I'm going to say that. So if you are looking to be, when we think about inclusion, when you are looking to be including people, that is sort of your intention. My question is also, if you're not actively including, then you're probably accidentally excluding, whether you realize it or not. It might be at a subconscious level, maybe it's on purpose, but I'm going to say most times it may be accidental. Yeah, and that's, but you're talking, yes, and I may say that may be organizational culture in some places, right? So I've been in organizations where we say we want to hear everybody's, when I talked earlier about, organizations, we want to hear from everybody, we want everybody's opinion, but do we? When you give your opinion, maybe they don't want it necessarily, or maybe they're hearing it, but they're like, I'm going to recycle that because it just doesn't align with what we want. So they may think they're including, but they're not. So I hear what you're saying, but I'm going to tell you from a high level, generally speaking, if you aren't, this is what I say to people who should be at the table. And maybe you should be at the table. Maybe you make them uncomfortable at the table. And so that's a conversation that needs to be had, is why are you making someone uncomfortable if you're raising certain points?
When it comes to minoritized or racialized, most will tell you they feel it was intentionally excluded.
Yeah.
So that will be looked at from the lens of those who are feeling or thinking that. Like you just said, it was past.
Yeah.
I travel, I stay in restaurants. We all have our stories.
That's right.
So when I see something like that, I'm a little concerned because that is presuming that is a blanket statement for everybody, and that is not necessarily true.
Okay, I accept that. That may be well, and again, that may be, again, your lived experience. I'm telling you, when I do these trainings with people and companies, I go in and I say, I'm going to go in with the assumption that for the most part, you all have good intentions. That's why you've hired people to come in and do DEI work at your organization, right? That's where I start. Because to move people on the dial, I need to start where they're at to move them along the continuum. And it's a continuum. You know that, and I know that. So I'm not discounting what you just said, but I'm going to tell you, when you go into companies, you want to move them along, we need to start where they're at in order to do that. So this is a Brené Brown video. How many are you familiar with Brené Brown? Okay, so if we have time to play it, maybe not. It's a couple of minutes, but what I'll do is I'll maybe share the link with you later. I'll get them to share. It's a couple of minutes long, but what she talks about is vulnerability and courage and how they're the same side of a coin. And is that okay? All right. Sorry. Maybe it's not going to play. It's not going to play. So it's okay. I'll stop here and I'll just pause and give you the floor and ask you just to think a little bit about what are you taking away from today. I want to think about what you might put into place in terms of your organization tomorrow or the day after, whatever it may be. And what is your growing edge? And feel free to send me messages and thoughts on that. Or if you'd like to ask, you can right now. And this is some additional information about me. Okay? So this is where you can contact me, call me, message me, email me. But if you had to say what was something that you took away, we can, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Georgetta Zanatti. Let me take a moment to ask, let's have a little bit of feedback. What was one or two takeaways that we can hear from the floor?
I like the SBI.
Yeah.
It's a variant of the clear leadership work with its pushback out of Sammy Fraser, what I observe, what I want, what I face, what I feel, right? I like that. It's about owning your own, therefore it doesn't invite someone to kind of start an argument.
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to tell you it works when we do. And I tell people, and you just ask for feedback. We say feedback is a gift. So sometimes I'll go in and go, so I have a gift for you today. So we need to have an SBI moment. And then, what I tell people is, your body language and your tone will actually be how you are able to navigate the conversation. So if I go in kind of angry and upset, that's going to take it in a whole other. But if I go in where we need to have an SBI moment, so this was the situation, this was the behavior, this was the impact, feedback is a gift, so I have a gift, and people always smile when I say that. I have a gift for you today. I've got some feedback. But it does actually change the outcome and the tone, and that doesn't change the severity of what we're talking about, but it does actually allow us to get to a happy place in terms of the conversation.
Nice, thank you. One more piece of appreciation for what you just heard from Dr. Zanatti? Yes.
One of the things that you said was that we understand ourselves through our experiences with others, and that's something that I've never thought about before, but that's something that I think I'll carry with me beyond this. So
Thank you. No, thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So we're going to move to our next panel, and I want to welcome you on here for the panel.
Okay.
So Dr. Zanatti is joining us for the panel. We're going to get our panelists up here and our moderator, and I'm wondering if I can have two volunteers help me from our crew to just take this off so that we're not restricting. I'm glad that you came all this way, Dennis, to take this off. Is that? Oh, yeah. Go. We're moving this.
Nice to meet you, Alexi Hammer.
Hi.
My thing came off, but maybe I might have. It came off? You can hold it up too. Yeah, come over here. Have our moderator over here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to have one more mic just in case.
You want one more mic?
Yeah, obviously just in case one of them goes off.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Perfect. So welcome to our final panel of the evening. Some folks have been here since 8 o'clock this morning. I have been here since the very beginning, and honestly, I found it so valuable, so impactful. I have been wondering why every single seat in this room has not been full and filled. And so I really want you to think about how moving forward you might keep connecting with the Center for Intellectual Excellence and promoting this work, because the value of what we've been receiving today has been outstanding. I'm going to tell you, I'm not too upset, because it's given us so much one-to-one time with all our presenters. We've had a chance to ask so many questions and connect. And so I'm bringing you to the final panel of this afternoon. We still have an online event tomorrow. This panel is on advocacy and allyship, active bystander versus passive bystander. So we have a couple people that we are continuing to join us. Dr. Zanatti is here continuing to join us. Alex Ihamo is here, who was here with us yesterday on a panel. We have a few new people to introduce to you today. I'd like to introduce to you Jill Chesney, who is here. Pardon me, Jill Chesley.
Thank you. Yep.
Jill Chesley. Jill is the Director, Strategy and Planning at MacEwan University Office of Human Rights and Equity and Inclusion. I think it's
Equity and Inclusion.
Equity and Inclusion. Okay, thank you. Jill is coming to us with over 25 years of domestic and international experience in the nonprofit, private, and public sectors. Jill has developed in-depth knowledge within the fields of intercultural competence, equity, and diversity and inclusion. So prior to this role, Jill was at the City of Edmonton as the Diversity and Inclusion Lead and was responsible for the development and implementation of the Art of Inclusion report. Some of you may be familiar with it. It was the Diversity and Inclusion Framework. Jill was also leading D&I strategy and policy development, including the Gender-Based Analysis Plus, design and delivery of training, program development and coordination, as well as employee engagement via vehicles such as diversity and inclusion committees and employee resource networks. Jill has lived in many places in the world. Here's a few of them. So aside from the esteemed city of Edmonton right here in Alberta, Canada, Jill has lived in Japan, Trinidad, Tobago, Sri Lanka, South Africa, and Afghanistan. Jill also has a master's in intercultural relations, is the founding chair of the Edmonton Business Diversity Network and the National Municipal D&I Network in Canada. She is a qualified administrator of the Intercultural Development Inventory and a senior facilitator of personal leadership. You're very welcome to the panel, Jill.
Thank you.
And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. R.A.C.E. Amory. Dr. Amory is an advocate and an expert in intercultural education and developing, promoting, and sustaining diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging initiatives so everyone can thrive in their personal and professional lives. She holds a Master of Education in Teaching English to speakers of other languages and creativity in educational practice, and a Doctor of Education specializing in adult education. I just lost my place. There we go. Her doctorate is focusing on intercultural education. It's from the University of Calgary, and she has over 15 years of experience working in higher education, where she has developed sociocultural programs for international students and internationally trained project managers in Canada and England. She has fostered strategic partnerships and formed and led post-secondary advisory boards. She is currently the CEO of Intercultural Collaborations Incorporated and consults with businesses and higher education institutions to implement DEI initiatives and support the creation of more equitable classrooms and practices and workplaces. She has worked in education institutions, businesses, and organizations in Canada and South Africa and Costa Rica. Maybe you two ran into each other in South Africa.
A little bit, yeah.
And then someone will ask us, Alex will ask you, where in South Africa? And let me introduce you to our moderator today, who is Salima Koja. Salima has a master's degree in commerce, is a CPA by profession, has spent 2 decades working progressively nationally and internationally in the banking sector, and with not-for-profits and at all 3 levels of government. One of my favorite pieces of information here is that Salima speaks 5 languages. I'm sure many people here also speak multiple and 5 languages. And I'm wondering if one of them is the one I also speak, my home language. Lekin baad mein dekhenge ki hum log baat kar sakte hain ki nahi. Oh yeah. So as a sessional instructor, Salima teaches on soft skills and technical subjects at post-secondary institutions. She leads on speaking engagements on DEI, conflict management, conflict resolution, and is very passionate about diversity, inclusion, and equity. She works with many individuals from diverse backgrounds and various experiences nationally and internationally. She hopes to make a positive difference in everything she does, and I'm absolutely sure she will as the moderator of this panel. Very welcome.
I hope so. You will. Okay, so thank you, Shalini, for your generous words. And it is my pleasure to moderate this discussion. And first of all, thank you for this amazing audience who have stayed with us for this long. And thank you for the people working in the background, Duke and your folks, making this so smooth for all of us here. So thank you. And without further ado, we'll begin the discussions. And my first question will be for you, Dr. Georgette. So what does it mean for you to be an ally and an advocate? And do you think allyship can exist without advocacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, when I think about allyship, I often say to people, and especially when I do my training, I say to people, it's great if you buy a T-shirt or if share a post. Those are really nice things to do. And as I was saying earlier, that's what I talk about, intentions versus, implementation versus integration. Those are nice. That's called ticking off the box. It's easy to do. The hard work for me when it comes to allyship is actually moving aside, creating opportunities, making sure people's voices are heard, sticking your neck out if you need to make sure that, people have the space to be who they are. And if you see something wrong, you speak up and you advocate. So you need to be able to be willing to do that and have the advocacy to do that. It also actually means showing up every single day and doing the hard work. And I can give you examples of things that I've done in the workplace where not necessarily super popular, but it did make a change. And that to me was what was important. And so that's what kind of keeps me going in terms of doing that. But in addition to the work, I do a lot of work in the community. And again, when you're doing work in the community, what does that group particularly need and do? So the other thing I tell folks is I'm not an ally because I'm walking around going, I'm an ally to this community. That community needs to see me and accept me as an ally, and then I'm an ally. Not because I think I'm walking around because I shared a post or wore a T-shirt or attended an event that somehow I'm an ally. I think those, again, are good intentions. But that particular group has to see me as such and welcome me as such.
Jill, Erica, Alex, would you like to weigh in?
Sure. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Did you say Jill?
Or did you?
Said Jill.
Jill.
Okay. Can you hear me when I speak? Okay. So I think the two concepts, allyship and advocacy, are pretty linked. When I think of allyship, I think of for people, for groups. So what am I doing? What are people who aren't a part of a particular underrepresented or equity deserving group? What are they doing to help forward equity and inclusion for those groups? And when I think of advocacy, I think of more around how am I influencing and changing the systems at play, and how am I advocating for action to be taken in support of those groups.
Erika, your thoughts?
I was going to say we've talked a lot about this throughout today, yesterday. Allyship is a lot of self-work, self-development, looking at your privilege if you have privilege. And it's continual work, advocacy, you're taking that step and magnifying people's voices if they can't share their voices. But I also think it's working with people. I think we should work in partnership, ideally, with everyone.
Great points. Alex?
Just to, I guess, add to what's been said so far, I'm just wondering how many people have actually taken the time, just by show of hand, to look at the original meaning of allyship, not the dictionary definition. How many people here have taken the time to research the original meaning of allyship, not dictionary definition? If you just Google it, which is you don't have to read it for you can do that later. Allyship comes from a Latin word alligere, which means to bind. To bind, that means we are inseparable. And it is for nations, and it began from wartime. That means we are ready to go to war. I'm ready to die for you, and you're ready to die for me. So when we throw words like allyship, I think what most people are referring to is fan. You know, you go to a soccer game and they say, yes, go Manchester United. That's a fan. Now, when they start to fight, you know, they often fight in some of those games. That's a supporter. A supporter will cross over and hit the other people, right? I'm not saying we go around hitting. I'm just trying to make a difference. There's a fan, which many people are. They are fan of diversity. They are fan of Muslim. They are fan of gay. They are fan of this. Then supporter means you stick your neck out, be willing to lose your job. Allyship means you're willing to resign. It's here, the definition. It is from allyship. In my book, Mystic of Leadership, I have a chapter on allyship where I talk about the true allyship began in 1944, where General Eisenhower gathered 13 nations to fight Hitler. Those people left their family saying, we are allied, we are willing to die for this. They left. So let's be careful when we say allyship. Allyship that I have seen, that most of us have seen, are really fans. That means you speak up when it's convenient, and when your job or your position is on the line, you withdraw. Allies never withdraw. Fact, they are willing to sacrifice whatever they put on the table. So allyship, that's the definition. I didn't come up with it. It's right there. So
that's really great.
Yeah, so when we move into advocacy, which I think they have defined here, you speak up as well. It's like a lawyer. You speak up, you advocate. But there's a fundamental, I think the deeper meaning of allyship needs to be said so people understand that is from a military term, which means I'm willing to die for you. And there are people who are willing to die for other people, which is okay. But that's really where it comes from. So the question is, we should ask ourselves, are we allies? Are we fans? Are we supporters? Or are we advocates? They're quite different.
And there's also the term of championship. I'm just going to say to what you said. So, I mean, I think sometimes even like intersectionality, some of the definitions change. You talked about, do people stick their neck out? I think some people are willing to do that. I've said to you, like, I can share stories. But that to me is because it falls on is it right or is it wrong? And if I have a place of privilege, which in places of jobs where I have, if I don't speak up, who will? And I think people need to see it that way in order for the world to change.
Oh, great points. And I'm sure everybody would like to hear about your personal experiences with this, with allyship and advocacy.
So if you let me just build on that, and thanks for adding that. I sit with executives all the time. At every point in time, I'm coaching about 30 CEOs or senior executives. And they sit in front of me, with CEOs United with Canada Basketball and all these folks. I find, this is my own personal experience in finding that those that are truly allies, like I'll give you a very specific example. There's a white man who is a deputy associate minister in Ontario, high position. And when you see him, he's just a white guy. But what you don't know, his wife is Trinidadian. And he every day, his wife goes through racialized situation. So he has a vested interest in seeing transformation. We went to PEI, we spoke to many mayors. There's one mayor, you can see he's almost bouncing in his chair. Literally after this stuff, he came, he said, oh, I lived in Africa and we went to do work since I was a kid. You can feel that he identifies on a deeper level with the pain and the struggle of the people you claim to be allies for, right? So, but then when you see advocates, I sit in front of them, they'll say, we got to do this, it's the right thing to do. And it's okay, that's just where they are. So, okay, let's do this. We work with them to do it. But when we start hitting roadblock, we find, and research will back it up, that those that are willing to move the mountains are those that are true allies and not the advocate.
So, Jill, would you want to share your personal experience with allyship and advocacy, and what challenges have you faced?
Sure. So I guess one of the things is that because of the jobs I've had, especially in the last decade, it's been my job to be an ally and an advocate. And it's a beautiful thing to get paid for, I must say. But I hear a lot of people talking about allyship and how, certainly it starts with me understanding me and where I am, what's my social location, what's my experience in the world, and then learning more. But a lot of people stop at the learning piece. So it's great if we're learning about anti-racism, and I say that as a white cisgender woman. It's great if we're learning about anti-racism or learning about transphobia or that sort of thing. But allyship, that's not enough as an ally. It's great that you're learning, but need to take action. And that's the harder piece. It's great to sit in my office and read books or look at things online and build my knowledge. But if I'm not actually doing something, if I'm not voting in ways that will contribute toward equity in the world, if I'm not spending my dollars in places that are going to support different groups, if I'm not reaching out to people who are harmed, especially in my sphere, like at work or in my personal life, then I can't really call myself an ally. If I'm not calling people in with difficult discussions like the SDI, it's hard. Allyship is hard. And now I'm not like, oh, it's so hard to be an ally. That's not what I'm saying. But it's a place of discomfort, and it's a place we need to move to, and always experience, and I guess move through to actually contribute. So I think advocacy is interesting too, because if I'm talking about trying to advocate to change systems or practices or policies, in my experience, that really depends on the relationships I've developed and the reputation I've created for myself professionally. And the better both of those things are, the more likely the impact I'm going to have. So relationships and community is really important for both of those.
Erika, what challenges have you faced in advocating or being an ally?
So I would just like to build off what Jill said about building the relationships. I think is so important. Sitting down and actually talking to people rather than making assumptions is one of the challenges I've experienced. I recently had a conversation with some white males in a networking event I was in, and they were scared I was going to start accusing them, blaming them. And they said, we've had enough of this DEI work, so that's definitely a challenge. Resistance and buy-in from leaders. I've worked in companies, been on boards where I've had a lot of pushback. They see DEI work and being ally more as a frill, and it gets put on the back burner. But that's why I believe we have to work together. It's about connecting with others, working together, and keep pushing the needle forward.
Good points. Dr. George, would you like to share something?
Well, it's funny. I was thinking about when I was talking earlier, like you call out the bad behavior and just, the definition of it. And, a few years back, I was, senior leader at the university. And there was a situation where we had sort of a bit of divisiveness happening. And I thought, okay, we were supposed to have this meeting. The meeting got kind of split up. Everybody wasn't included. What was interesting was the people that were excluded were the one Black male and the women. And then the other half of the group continued to meet. And I thought, oh, so first I thought the meeting was canceled. So when I called, they said, no, actually, they kind of had this group and not the other group, right? And we had sort of casually referred to it as Team A and Team B. So I sent an email that just curious as to why the meeting continued to proceed. The collectiveness of this other group is at least 85 years of experience that could, and all of us intersect with the work that's happening. And then I got back a 3-page email about, I'm sorry if you felt this way, and I'm sorry if you. So of course I didn't respond to that. So when I saw the person, when we were having the meeting, and shuffling papers, and then sits down and says, well, I'm really sorry if you felt this particular way. And then they went on to explain, and I said, if you think you're going to get an it's okay out of this girl, it ain't going to happen today, just to be clear. I said, so I don't know what you want your legacy to be in the organization, but if it really is about equity and inclusion and the things that you're saying, you literally just excluded the one Black person in this room and out of the conversation. So you can decide what you want your legacy to be. I'm just pointing out the obvious. If it makes you uncomfortable, ask yourself why that is. So to his credit, I'm going to say that was kind of like the penny dropping, and then there were a lot of changes. And when people would cut off this other person, like he would sort of say, no, I want to hear what this person has to say. And the behavior changed. But, you might say I stuck my neck out. Maybe for me, it was just the right thing to do. And it was very obvious, and it was not okay. And if I wasn't going to speak up, who was? So I did. And it changed.
That was very brave. That was indeed very brave. So my next question is tied to that, and that would be for you. So big part of advocacy is, as we talked yesterday, so stepping out of your comfort zone and sticking your neck out and speaking up to the authorities. So when somebody wants to do that, what would be your practical advice for someone who wants to do that?
My practical advice for anybody who wants to get involved in social justice is very simple. Is how far are you willing to go? It's a question we all need to think about. You can't go halfway in social justice. If you're on the march to Washington, you're on the march to Washington. You can't get off in Buffalo. So how far are you willing to go? Many people don't ask themselves that. Even organizations, we got to do EDI. They don't even estimate the cost. They don't estimate the impact. They don't estimate what they're doing. I have a video on YouTube. It's called the 10 biggest blunder organizations make in EDI work. And it's very simple. How far are you willing to go? So my advice to anybody, the first one is really examine yourself. Like I've asked a question, I won't do it here, but I'll say, if you consider an ally, raise up your hand. And in most cases, you see everybody confidently raise up their hand. Okay, and I say, I'm not picking on anybody, don't take this very personal. You are your ally for, says, yeah, I'm ally for the black. I don't like what's happening. I think we need to make a change. I say, if I go through your phone right now and look at the top 20 phone numbers you make, is there a black person on that number? Do you have friends that are black? I will refer you all, but you may not remember this, but in Toronto, we used to have a mayor, fine guy. He's dead now, Rob Ford. He's the brother of Doug Ford. And I remember I was involved in this mayoral debate. And one of the questions was, what's your plan for black people? He says, don't accuse me about the black people. He says, I used to be a coach on the soccer team and they were all black. Really? That's your plan for black people in Toronto? Right? So how many people that are not like you, that are your friends outside work? Outside work. How many, in fact, inside work? I've seen executives who've confessed to me and say, you know, I just don't know what to say. Like, there's this woman always those things. I say hijab. Yes, okay. I don't know what to say. I said, say it to her what you would say to a white woman. Like, hello, how are you? Like, build friends with people. Don't go talking corporate allyship when you don't have personal allyship. In fact, you have no business talking about corporate allyship until you have friends that don't look like you, that don't talk like you, that don't love like you, that don't pray like you. I see a lot of directors doing that. I ask them, I say, Matt, give me a number of a black person you're on it for. He said, well, I know, no. I know you know these ones. Who do you call on your email? Who do you chat with, right? I speak to Olympians and executives too, and they'll say, before they show up in meetings, a meeting has already been held by the predominant group, which in most cases are white, before the black guy or black woman or the woman comes in. So let's take a deep dive into ourselves and find out if we are truly, truly allies. Do we have friends that don't look like us, that don't talk like us, that don't pray like us? Do you have a Muslim friend? Do you have a gay friend? Like, you can say, well, I live in an area where they don't exist. No, but now they're everywhere. Find somebody, know what they like, their custom, their culture, their tradition, their pain, and all that, before you can say, raise that hand. That's my take on that.
That's great perspective. Given your experience working with all those different organizations, what's your practical advice for someone who wants to be an ally or an advocate?
Well, it's hard to top that. But maybe to build on it, like if I think about in an organization, there's ways to get involved. So one of the last groups mentioned diversity inclusion committees, mentioned employee resource groups. Those can be really powerful ways to explore allyship and take action. I think there's also small ways in just like your team meetings. For example, if, we've all heard the story about the person who shares an idea and it's ignored until someone of a different background shares the idea. And then it's like, oh, what a great idea Bob had, for example. Like, we can amplify the voices of each other and say, oh, that's actually, that was Sal's idea. So I think I think people get scared, like you mentioned, like people get, and when I say people, I mean often white people, white men, we're scared if we're not doing everything perfectly, if we don't know all the answers, if we're not, there's this really interesting morality that's assigned with D&I and equity, and people are worried that if they're not gonna be seen as doing it perfectly, they just don't want to step their toes in at all. So I think maybe on that note, my practical advice is just get used to making mistakes and make the mistake and learn from it and move on, and you'll get better as an ally and as a person, really.
Such a great perspective. Dr. Chaljan, any comments?
Well, I think that's great. I think both what you said, it's funny, I think she mentioned earlier, I've written a book called The Power of One, The Power of Us, right? Why not you? And it's the second version, but I always start out with why not you? Like, the world is not going to change unless we begin with ourselves. And so, people always say, well, I can't make a difference. I'm just like one person. I'm thinking, well, I can tell you stories for one person, like my TEDx talks was literally about like the one person impacting other people. So when it comes to practical tools, I think about, well, what are we individually doing? Are we making a difference? Are we speaking up? Are you going to make an introduction? So, I think I was sharing this with you earlier. I had a woman message me 2.5 years ago. Great idea for this idea to have 100 Black startups by 2025. Didn't know her. Thought we were maybe work together. No, just out of the blue on LinkedIn. So I said, okay. So she says, can I send you the PowerPoint? I said, no, why don't you, I'll give you 20 minutes of my time. Why don't you go through it with me? So brilliant, didn't need anything. I said, you should be working with a university. She said, yeah, I don't know people. I said, well, I do, because I spent 30 years at the university. Let me make a couple of calls. So not only do I make a call, but I also make an introduction. Well, now that organization is getting a ton of money. They're going to exceed their targets. They're growing, and they are the, shining star for what they do. And I have the privilege of sitting as, a senior advisor to that group. But it was being able to, I don't know, is that advocacy, is that allyship? I don't know. It was making the things that need to happen, but also speaking to people who are kind of not so sure at the university, like, well, yeah, I said, no, this is being handed to you on a silver platter, like literally give this a chance. And it is just like an outstanding thing that they're doing, right? So I do think there are ways, and I think people are sometimes, to your point, Jill, about, they don't know where to begin. And you sort of, in your previous question, was asking about kind of what do you measure? I've worked with organizations where there's a ton of things to measure. Where do you begin? And so I always say to folks, you have to figure out what it is that matters to you, what you can measure, and what you can do. Because there could be 150 things. You can't get them all done. You're not going to have the resources. So we don't get the DEI burnout that you were talking about. I think you have to figure out what is it that you can do, what can you do in 1 year, what you build on that and build on that and build the momentum, but it has to matter to the organization, and it has to matter to the people in the organization, the entire staff, not just the senior leadership.
So please, if you allow me to leverage what you said, what you did, that's moving from allyship to sponsorship. That's what you stuck your neck out. Because frankly, what if you recommended that person and they messed up, so to speak? I'm just saying, but it will reflect on you. But you were not even thinking that because you wanted to really help. So that is what organized leaders.
Can I tell you something? What I've heard today, so many people talk about when they face microaggressions, and people of color, what happens is they lose confidence. So I had full confidence. So I'm going to give that full confidence to anyone I can open the door for.
Yes,
right?
and so you act as allyship. So that is what executives need to be doing. Sponsor people who are minoritized.
I had no doubt she was, and I'm telling you, she's doing amazing, and I'm so proud of her.
So that is moving from ally, because you stick your neck out, so to speak. That's a word, right?
So that's a great segue for me to move away from this to move into equitable experiences. So Jill, my next question is for you. So given your background working for those large organizations, what are some of the successful strategies to create inclusive and equitable experiences for people in your organization? That's successful.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a big question, right? So when I think about, I'm going to bring up again, we can do things in an organization that can contribute to an inclusive culture. And those are things like opportunities, like diversity inclusion committees, like employee resource groups. And I heard that mentioned a few times. And I want to say that in my experience, employee resource groups can be very powerful groups to contribute to the business of an organization, because they often exist outside the standard hierarchy of communication. So for example, in your average person, if they want to communicate up, they have to go through their boss, then their boss's boss, then their boss's boss, and who knows if the message ever gets up to leadership. An employee resource group should have an executive sponsor at the leadership level, and they can bypass all this hierarchy and give their feedback directly to their executive sponsor, who sits at the executive leadership table. And I've seen that make change and influence the culture. So that's one thing. The other thing is the power of being in community for people from marginalized groups. The power of being in community with people who look like me, have the same life experiences as me, that can really contribute to creating an inclusive culture. So all these things can exist, but someone can still have an exclusive experience on their team with their leader, right? So then we need to work with leaders. There's research that shows that a diverse team can outperform a homogenous team if managed well, right? That if managed well is really important. So we need to work with leaders, and training is important, but training, someone earlier said, like, everybody's behavior isn't going to change by sitting through a 3-hour course on diversity or bias or something, but it's a place to start. But then there also needs to be resources for leaders and coaching for leaders and a place where they can reach out with those questions that might be vulnerable, that take courage. Someone earlier also mentioned vulnerability and courage. I think that was you actually talk about Brene Brown's. So we can do things as an organization to help people feel like they belong, where they can be in community with each other, and this kind of work is recognized as organizational business, so they get paid to be there. But then we also need to do things on the other side, which is in actual teams and actual leadership, and help people treat each other where they feel included as well.
And I think we also have to have, we talked about this earlier, is it's ongoing work. It's not going to happen in 1 hour, 2 hours. We're still here decades later. So it's ongoing commitment and checking in with everybody. I know Jill just spoke about belonging. I think that's a huge piece that's often forgotten. They say you can have the DEI, everything in place, but then there's lots of people who don't feel they belong. They don't feel they have something valuable to contribute. There's people that are not extroverted, that don't feel they have a place at the table. They may be more introverted, so their voice is often not heard. So it's just important to ongoing work and working together.
And it must be said that if you want to progress in your career, you are going to need an ally. Just somebody who can make a call, somebody who can give a reference. And for generations, hundreds, if not thousands of years, what has created the predominant group, which again, white folks, is allyship. So allyship is not black, white, or gay, straight, or allyship is somebody who's willing to stand and vouch for you. So they do it very well, right? Oh, hello, my son just graduated from York University. You have something for him? Boom, they get a job. But so for me, I progressed very well. And I think I mentioned this yesterday. I got 16 promotions in 15 years, salary grew 1,000% in the bank. It doesn't happen. I didn't do it by myself. I had white executives who believed in me. I say, I saw this job. It's like, you know what, Alex, I looked at it. I think you'll be good. I'll call Jill or somebody, right? And then they give me a fair chance of the interview. So they didn't give it to me because somebody made a call, but at least they encouraged me. They validated me. They inspired me. They pushed me. You see what I'm saying? Alex, I think you should apply for that. So, and these were mostly white folks, right, who did that for me to progress through the banking system like that. So I'm encouraging everybody here. There are true allies out there. It could be white, could be black, could be any. Just find a sponsor, call it whatever name, or a friend, a mentor. You need somebody these days to get to the next level. So allyship, we should not take it away and just say it's got to do with diversity and stuff. No, allyship is women to women allyship, men to men allyship. Allyship basically means somebody who can vouch for you, willing to stick their neck out, as you said.
And you prove to them to your competence. Right?
Exactly.
So that's
Yeah.
another point.
Yeah.
So, Dr. George, I would like to hear your micro and macro perspectives on this.
Yeah, like it's interesting because I think when I think about what you just said, I think more about the fact that you're talking about sponsorship and championship in many ways. And so it's important for us, I think, on a micro level to be aware, self-aware ourselves of what we want. There's a great little clip of Oprah Winfrey saying, someone said to her, how did you get to be so successful? And she said, well, I knew where I wanted to go. A lot of us don't even know where we want to go. If you said to someone, where do you want to be 2 or 3 years from now? And they don't necessarily. So I think as individuals, we would need to know where do we want to go, first and foremost, right? And then you need to figure out what does that roadmap look like? And who's going to be able to help you? And what connections are you making? How are you networking? What I call networking up, right? So, if I think about people, they always have people in the very similar roles to them, but who are you thinking about? If I want to be here in 2 years or 3 years, who's going to help me open that door? How do I make sure that that relationship is authentic? It's not just like I'm using that person, but really building trust, what I'm going to call stewarding those relationships to get you there. So, that's us individually. And then, working with those folks at the sort of, I'm going to say the micro level to build that and that trust. And so they are your champion. They are your sponsor. So the champion is the person that when you're not in the room is saying that so-and-so is so great, like that we should really give them an opportunity. The sponsor is the person at the organization that's really highly placed that is going to say, let's give them, we know it's a stretch assignment. We know it's a stretch, but we think they have the capability to reach it, right? And at the macro level, I think we need more people to feel that they can do that and it's not a threat. So often when people, are not giving you an opportunity or see you as a threat, it's because you don't look like them and they're worried about losing place of privilege, right? So part of that is just thinking a little bit about how do we navigate that. And, if I took it from a female lens, if I just may, like when you look at boards, they say if you have one woman on a board, that doesn't change anything. 2 women on a board doesn't change anything. 3 is the tipping point. And I think that would probably apply a lot more to even when we think about the BIPOC community and the representation. The more you see, the more it's possible. But I think at the micro level, we need to figure out what we want. At the macro level, we need to make sure we have the structure in place and the champions who are willing to do it for us.
That's a great point, yeah. So my next question is again for you, Jill, just given your experience. So how can organizations move beyond representations and more inclusive at the decision-making tables? And how can they ensure the success of this group if they're at the decision-making table?
Another big question. So I think we talked about culture and how people can support each other, but really these changes aren't going to happen unless there's systemic change. So, and leaders look to their policies and they look to the rules and the structure. And when I say policy, I mean like capital P policy, where it's an actual written policy versus it can also just be our practices, our unwritten rules of how to behave. Those need to be challenged because, okay, so I'm queer and I join a queer employee resource network and I feel included in that sphere because that's great, but I don't see anybody queer in leadership, right? So it's like, do I really belong here? I feel maybe supported at this level, but in leadership, I don't see anybody queer. And someone earlier mentioned too, like the higher up you go in an organization, the less visible diversity there is as well. So I think in terms of supporting leaders, we need to hire people who have that interest and who have some, like we need to hire at the executive level and the senior leadership level, like inclusion, anti-racism, reconciliation needs to be part of that interview process. What's your commitment? How have you just demonstrated your commitment to this in the past? How do you envision that impacting this organization? I think that should be part of the screening, part of the interview process for leaders. And then we know we're going to get people at the table who are at least have an intention, whether or not they know much, but they'd be more likely to learn. So that's one way. And I think organizations need to support and put resources to staff such as diversity inclusion teams, anti-racism teams, however the organization envisions it, because those teams really can support the growth of an organization.
So how do we bring this equity-seeking groups to the decision-making table, in your opinion?
Well, okay, well, we have to, so at the city of Edmonton, we had a real focus on GBA plus, which is gender-based analysis plus, but it wasn't just about gender. It was really about a process. It was an equity tool. So decisions, any decision that had to be made was supposed to be put through this decision-making tool where you do your research on best practice for whatever the decision is. Then you engage with the people who the project or the decision is going to impact, right? And if you can disaggregate that at all by different identity factors, that's really great. So you might engage all employees, but because majority rules don't work for everybody, we need to have a sense of, okay, all employees say we're 75% in favor of this, but really if we disaggregate by Black women, will that number be different? Indigenous men, will that be different? Queer people with a disability, will that be different? And that's part of where the advocacy comes in, where, okay, I'm going to challenge you, leader of mine, that you're saying that you're taking an equitable approach about this decision, but you haven't engaged employees in their thoughts about it. So, and you can engage, that's one of the reasons for the existence of an employee resource network, right? It's a group that's ready right there to provide you with feedback and advice. You can look at employee surveys and actually do something with that data. I don't know if it was someone earlier this morning mentioned that too, like take the data, but then do something with it. So there are ways to do it. It's just people aren't used to doing it. They're not used to asking people about, because, there's 7 of us executive leaders around the table. We can make this decision. They're not used to asking people. So it's about reminding them of that process.
So I think, yes. So what I often tell executives is this, and say, if you wanted to increase your profit 20%, do you? In most cases, they do. How do you do that? Well, we write it down in a strategic plan, and we put it on people's performance review.
Yeah.
And say, you know what? You need to hire, all your hires need to be 30% minoritized this year, or else it's going to affect your bonus. Same with you, executive, and same with you, marketing. When you put it on that performance review, and it affects the $200,000 they're going to take home Christmas, they make it happen. 100%. You have to mandate it. You have to write it down. They have to sign. Period. We've done this. It's not a mouth stuff. They bring us in. I can name organizations. United Way, Canada Basketball. I name all of them. Seriously. They brought us in, but we fought. I will use the word fight. It's unfortunate. Fight means they are resisting, and eventually. So I'll give you a very good example. Canada Basketball. I said that because it's public. They actually wrote an article on this, so it's not confidential, right? They engaged us on their Hall of Fame. Canada Basketball Hall of Fame, there was only one Black. Who plays basketball? I just Googled it. Google say 80% of basketball players are Black. The marketing director, Alex, that's in the US. I'm like, are we going to go that route? Let's go to Hamilton. Let's go to Brampton. Let's go to, you see, but this, I told the CEO, your Hall of Fame is like Hockey Hall of Fame. They fought, they resisted. And eventually, they wrote it down, they signed, and say, here's the rule we give to them. We said, when they get, one of them said, Alex, the nominations we get are for all white. Okay, you're correct. You have to go find the Black nominations. How do you find equity? Go to the community. I can connect you with gay group, Black group, women group, Muslim group. They will recommend people to you. So you have to go to the community to find it. So for the first time, it's good news. It was on the news, so it's public information. The people who got Hall of Fame in Canada basketball, they had to go and find people who played way back to ensure that up to 40% were minoritized group. So for the first time, we have Blacks who played basketball 20 years ago coming out from the woodworks to be recognized. Here's the reason why it was all white in the first place. The marketing director was right. It's white people that nominate. I went to speak to Black players who were retired. In fact, many of them found me on LinkedIn. I said, Alex, we heard you doing some work. Here's my opinion. What they find, I say, we don't nominate because we've been nominating for years and they never chose the people we nominate. So Blacks stopped nominating because they never chose them, right? So, and that is what happened. So you have to go find them. We mandated indigenous, and here's what we found out, that there is a huge indigenous community that plays basketball. Massive. They even have their own tournament, just the way they have it in Canada. And nobody ever went to them. So how do you bring those equity-seeking people to the table? You write it down as a strategic goal. You put some signatures on it. Then you write policies to ensure that it happens, and you tag their bonuses to it. Believe me, they will find them and bring them to the table.
That's a great point.
So I have a little comment on the policies, if I may, sorry. So I think policies are great, but they they really don't change minds. They keep people in check, right? And that's really what you're talking about. So I think, they're great to put them into place, but to change the mindset and the thinking requires a little bit more work. And I think when it comes to the inclusion, some of the things that you're all talking about, tying it into performance is really important, but I think also creating the pipeline is really important. So how do we create the pipeline of talent? Because we know there isn't a shortage of BIPOC talent that's really strong, right? So part of that, I think, is creating like what I'm going to call a matrix system, but not just, when you're doing the kind of how do we move the person in, sometimes it's what's holding you back as a manager. One manager that's not that great, or just you're really a rock, you're a rock star. So I like you working for me. I don't want you going anywhere else because you're making my life easier, right? So how do we create a matrix system so that people can move? And then how do we ensure there's champions? And then how do we create a roadmap for that person or that group of people to move through the organization in a meaningful and sustainable way? So yes, policies are good, but we need more than that, I think. And sorry, I know you were going to say something.
No, and that was a great point, because my next question was, how do we set them up for success? So yes, we have them at the decision table, but the second point is, how do we set them up for success?
Yes, and the first thing to set them up for success too is having those programs, mentorship. But I think the success of anybody really, first of all, lies in your hand. Like she had mentioned, if I don't have the plan to progress in the bank, so to speak, like I'm going to remain where I am. Like somebody like me, I got in the bank, I say, I'm going to run this bank. That was my mindset. 15 years later, I got 16 promotions and my salary grew because I wanted that and I went after it. So, but the organization too have to create an enabling environment. So there's the micro, as you would say, and then the macro. So we first of all have to say, I want to go to this position or go to this position, or I just want to remain where I am. And in that case, you stay. But on the organizational part, they need to create the inclusive culture through resource group that Jill was talking about and some of all this enabling stuff to make them successful.
That's great perspective. Yeah. Erica, I want to hear your perspective.
Oh, yeah, so I was just going to say we also need to have unconscious bias training. I know there was some pushback. I think it was in the States, probably here, probably not, obviously not just one time and it's going to solve everything. But as was mentioned before, we all have biases. We all have unconscious biases. I've taken the Harvard implicit test before. So building that into the programs, the giving it to the leaders, and not hiring people just because they're diverse. I think that's what part of the problem has been. Maybe they're in the policies, they put up a claim on their website saying we are diverse, and then you start talking to people and they don't feel as if they're included. They don't feel as if they belong. So just, checking, doing the employee resource groups, having one-on-one meetings, and looking at your practices every single day.
That's a great point. My next question is for you, Dr. Georgia. Okay. So how do we create those psychologically safe spaces, and how do we address those microaggressions, especially for folks, for everyone, but also for folks in the leadership category?
Yeah. So my own experience has been when I've seen microaggressions happen, I've had conversations with leadership. So I had a situation where there were very significant microaggressions, actually. I've experienced myself, but actually to colleagues that worked with me. And they were both visible minorities, different ethnicities. And, they were actually representing me at a meeting. So they'd gone in to represent me at a meeting. And interestingly enough, there was a response back from somebody very senior. I didn't realize they copied them, referring to both of them in very derogatory terms. So this poor fella comes to me sort of apologizing, saying, Georgette, I really wasn't doing it. And I was like, not like, so he had worked with me for 7 years. I can assure you, he would not have survived 7 years if that was the way the behavior was. So I read the email and I thought, I cannot believe that this person sent this email, but it was clearly what they thought. Did not realize they hit reply all. But my colleague was apologizing for something he did not do. So I then actually said, I'm taking this up the food chain. And he was like, I don't want any issues. And I'm like, they need to apologize to you, not the other way around. And so then that person sort of starts to backpedal a little bit. And I said, this person should not be running a program. And I was in a very senior leadership role. So I was going to exercise my authority to ensure I was not only advocating, I was being an ally, but I also did not feel from a my own authentic sort of value set that that person should be doing, leading and so forth. So I think there are opportunities sometimes for us to change the game, change the direction, and be able to say this is not okay. But also, like for me, the person that poor fellow and that woman actually felt that they did something wrong when they were actually the victims and not the person, but they were thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened. So I am going to say that I sort of, probably a little bit like Alex, like I have the confidence to be able to speak up, and I know who I am, and I know where I'm going to, because I know I'm going to be on the right side of justice when it matters. And so I think that's really important. But I think for me, my takeaway from that too is they realized, they walked away thinking, okay, my boss actually gives a hoot, and is has my back and is willing to do that. And that actually, I hope, when they are faced with something like this again, that they're going to step up and do the same thing for other people and be that voice and know that they can in a safe space, right? Because I did it for them. I hope that they'll feel that they can do it for somebody else.
Great point. Jill, would you like to weigh in?
Can you say that again?
I was going to say, would you like to weigh in to this?
I had something brilliant in my mind, and it just escaped. I don't know if this is particularly relevant to what Georgette was just saying, or in particularly the question, but when I think about allyship and I think about the context we're in the world right now, there's so much more apparent freedom to be hateful, to say hateful things, to hurt people, in ways that I know that they've always been there, but they're out and proud with the hate in ways that I haven't seen before. And when I think about that, and I think about the context of allyship, it's even more important that we're all, because we can all be an ally for someone else. All of us have places of privilege in our lives, whether it's our mental health, our race, our sexuality, our gender. We can all be allies for somebody else. And I think that this has nothing to do with your question, but it's sort of what's happening with my mind right now.
I'll ask you the question that will address, so how do we address the white privileges?
How do we address the
privileges?
How do we address the white privilege?
Yeah. How do we?
Oh, that small question.
I was going to say that.
How do we address the white privilege? In my experience, there's been some really extreme reaction to that phrase. And in the context of, and I think, Georgette, you said this also in your presentation, we need to meet people where they're at. So if I'm meeting with people, if I'm working with a group of people who vehemently deny that there's such a thing as white privilege, and I go there and say, yes, there is, and they say, no, there's not, we're not going to get anywhere, right? So there needs to be some creativity to get to the point, to get to the context without maybe using the words that people seem to react so strongly to. And then there's other groups who are totally get it and totally accept that there's white privilege, and then you can have really deep, good conversations about it. I think there's a lot of information sharing and training that can be done before we get to white privilege. It's like, you don't talk to a kindergartner about grade 12 math. You know what I mean? Like, you need to meet them where they're at and build up to that conversation. So, yes.
Yeah, I agree with Jill. As I said, I've had some pushback. I come from rural Alberta. Everyone was white. So starting at the basics in my training, I usually have a social justice framework. But if I'm talking to a bunch of people that aren't quite at that level, that space yet, I start very basic, get them to look within themselves and not force people. So I think, like Jill said, it starts with the information and making people feel comfortable.
So we have 2 minutes, so 1 minute for Dr. Georgette and 1 minute for you.
So I think when it comes to white privilege, there's just, like, I want to share with you a little story. So, in the video that I unfortunately didn't play so well, if you have a place of privilege, it's important to know how to use it to help other people. So I'm just going to begin with that. But, I was a keynote speaker at an event about 1.5 years ago, and the gentleman and the audience was not very diverse. And there was somebody before me the year before, and it was a woman of color, and they had a lot of issues because somebody from the audience said, she talked to them about having privilege. And that fellow said, I don't have privilege. Like, my parents were immigrants and they worked really hard here. And it didn't go very well. And so, when I was sort of being, I'm going to say, interviewed to be the keynote, he said to me, well, how would you have dealt with that question? And I think what was interesting for me was I said, my response to that person was, I understand that you came as an immigrant to this country and that your family worked really hard. I get that part. The fact that you are lighter skinned than somebody with darker skin, how often do you get stopped, right? How often do you get stopped when you're walking out of a store, by the police, whatever? That in itself is privilege. That is what white privilege gives you. So maybe, yes, your parents came here, worked really hard, you accumulated wealth for whatever reason. Well, that also is a certain level of privilege. But I can assure you, like I tell people, I travel to the US all the time. If you go through the United States, like I have walked out of stores, I've got my receipt, they let me go. They'll stop the person of color behind me or even a Hispanic person to check. So I am fully aware of that when I walk by. I'm pretty sure somebody white who doesn't do this work is not aware of it. So it is important for us to educate people what white privilege means, because I think it feels like, well, I worked really hard to get here. I don't have privilege, but that's not what we're talking about.
So thanks for giving me that. So from a black man's perspective, who is visibly black, so I think the people that I've had success with, the white folks, executive or just friends, is to appeal to their empathy. It's really to help to connect if they still have. Not everybody have. Somebody like Donald Trump doesn't have. So, so it's to appeal to people's empathy to see, right? Because frankly, they can never understand. Like if I'm driving, I see a police car. I'm within speed limit. I still step on my brake. I'm not breaking any rule, but I still step on my brake. But a white person, I sit beside, they are speeding, and I'm looking at their speed limit. I'm seeing the police. They didn't even see the police at all, right? But I see them, right? And those are privileges that the white folks have. But when we talk about privilege, I know I have privilege. I think she said it best. Everybody has some form of privilege. When I'm dealing with minoritized folk, like I am here, I'm saying not everybody have my level of confidence or my intelligence or my, those are privileges I have. I can navigate my way in corporate organization. Some people may not have that privilege to do that. So everybody needs to be conscious that you have a form of privilege. I have a form of privilege, right? And then if we are able to communicate that to people who are resistant, so to speak, then it doesn't become white or black, because it's not really white or black issue. It's just a humanity issue. That's how I say it.
Oh, and I really like that point. It's a humanity issue. So we close on a very great note, and I'm sure we could go on and on with such a lovely panel, but we have to respect the time. So we'll wrap it up. And over to you, Shiv.
Thank you so much. Just quickly, were there any questions in the audience? It's removing. Because, you heard me say this yesterday, I love this model, which is leave them when they want more. So that there will be time to speak to our panelists, to continue the conversations. I want to thank this panel here on advocacy and allyship. I want to thank Salima Koja for your moderation of this, Alex Ihama, Dr. Georgette, Zanita, Erica, Amory, and Jill Chesley. Thank you so much for this conversation. While I was listening to you, I was thinking about something. I was reflecting on the whole day. We've had this panel. We had the panel on breaking the glass ceiling, which we had with Dr. Kwesi Mbolekwa, Ola Kunla Odanya, Osai Agiva, and that was moderated by Lisa Ochi. We had our DEI certification training with Dr. Shindale Seal. And we had our presentation by Dr. Georgette Zanatti. We've been thinking a lot, I think, about not only naming and understanding the issues that we're trying to communicate, but strategies for standing up for ourselves, for standing up with each other, but also how to communicate. And as I was listening and reflecting on the day, I was noticing how often we have to put a lot of attention on how do we get through to a group of people who have unconscious power. You know that phrase, that power is invisible to the people who have it, and giving up that power feels like oppression when they aren't realizing that they have power. We put so much attention on trying to navigate that and think about that and build each other up and develop skills and strategize and work to it. And it made my mind think about this piece where sometimes I think we have to split our minds a little bit. And we have to do two pieces of work, which is one, what Dr. Shindell Seal kept saying, the soft entry, what Dr. Georgette Zanatti was saying about how do you meet someone where they're at so that you can move it through, in contrast with what Alex Ehama was saying about, build yourself up, stand up and confront it front on, which I think could have some gender implications to it, in terms of how people respond differently. But on the one hand, we're thinking about how do we communicate and impact that group of people with power and privilege who aren't recognizing that, who are making such decisions. And I feel like sometimes we can also split our minds and think about it. I think it's absolutely okay to teach our 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds that privilege exists and totally acclimatize them to the situation, because it's not actually that hard or difficult a conversation. We're just dealing with 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds who've been socialized into thinking that it's okay for them not to hear about this or go there. It's a little bit of bad behavior, actually. And we could socialize our children to be totally comfortable with the concept and fight against it. So we have to do it in two different spaces. I was thinking about this. So thank you for your moment while I was thinking about, we're always moving on several agendas at the same time, and how do we support each other? So let me round off the day for you. Honestly, it was so impactful to me. I hope it was so impactful to you. The resources that were brought here today for us to connect with and speak to people in warm, living flesh, human bodies that are walking around with these ideas and these achievements and these connections for us to speak with. We had wonderful food, and I hope you packed it up and are taking some of the food with you. And I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for the event, the City of Edmonton and the Government of Alberta. I want to thank the organizers for this event and the staff here at the venue. And most importantly, and you're going to give an even bigger applause to this one, I really want to thank the volunteers who've been running this event. So we've been watching a lot of people move through, working together as a team, making this happen. And we must appreciate that labor of love that is the volunteers that move us and help us achieve social justice when we do it. So we have a program tomorrow as well, which is online tomorrow. So you may be in your pajamas when you log on. You may have just put on your shirt and tie and be in your shorts at home. You may go back into that strange COVID hybrid isolation thing we're doing, where you'll be all by yourself in the room. And that's when you're going to be missing the volunteers and the food and the conversation that we had in the middle. But we really want you to join us back online tomorrow. So the link is available. It's streaming on social media through YouTube, through Facebook, and through LinkedIn. The social media handle is CFI Canada. And a connection will also be available through the website. So you all remember the website, which is Inclusify, cfi.ca. And I got all this. I have an anxiety around social media, so I did all of that, and it all went well, and then my brain went blank. Social media.
Social media.
Okay, so we're going to regroup together online tomorrow at 2 p.m. I have the privilege of being on a panel tomorrow, so I'm really excited about that. And you won't have to see me tripping over introductions. But do you know what's going to be really interesting? Looking at each other eye to eye in tiny little boxes tomorrow. We're having the reverse experience where we've met each other in person and now we're going to see each other in boxes. So we're hoping that we'll join you there. And in the meantime, thank you to our panelists, and please speak to each other and safe home.
Thank you.